Jon Snow stood upon the battlements of the Red Keep, his eyes fixed on the harbor where the sun's last light shimmered over the Blackwater Bay. The Great War was done, but its victories felt hollow. The others were defeated, the Night King destroyed by a desperate coalition of the living. Yet peace did not bloom as cleanly as one might hope. The cost had been immense, and the scars lay deep as the shattered world lurched forward. Now, after much conflict and compromise, after the final downfall of Queen Cersei Lannister, and after a series of short-lived and chaotic power struggles, it was Jon Snow who had been crowned king of the Seven Kingdoms. But the beloved figure who had once urged compassion and mercy was fading into memory, replaced by someone harder, someone no longer content to trust in others or bend to the claims of honor. Too many betrayals, too much loss. These had shifted something essential in him. He had come to King's Landing as a reluctant conqueror, forced by fate and the unstoppable wave of events to occupy the capital when no one else could hold it without sparking another war. The first day he set foot on the charred remains of the city, the stench of smoke and the acrid tang of burned flesh still clung to every street. Those who remained cowered in corners or huddled among broken walls. His footsteps upon the ashes echoed with the sorrow of 1,000,000 dead. If the city's last sacking under Daenerys Targaryen had been a tragedy, this felt like an aftermath stripped of illusions. There was no final triumphant flourish, no merry songs. Only the hush of a bruised realm that knew it had survived total annihilation but did not yet know how to live again. Jon had once believed that duty was the death of love, and so it proved. He had loved many people, and each had been taken from him in turn. His father, his brother, his friends, Ygritte who died in his arms, Daenerys who became a storm of vengeance when the bells rang over King's Landing, and more. They were all ghosts crowding his mind. In the lull of the war's end, in the uncertain vacuum of power, Jon found himself pressed to claim the Iron Throne. The lords of Westeros would accept no one else with so credible a claim, and the battered small folk yearned for a figure behind whom they could rally. Some of the northern lords had dreamed he might restore the Seven Kingdoms with generosity, that the realm might gain a truly just leader. Others whispered that Sansa Stark might be the rightful queen in the north and were suspicious of Jon's Targaryen blood. But more than that, they were exhausted. Exhausted by the War of the Five Kings, by the undead invasion, by the dragonfire that had scarred King's Landing. They needed an end to their nightmares. Jon had never wanted the throne, but sometimes fate allows no other choice. Surviving the others had changed him. The knowledge of his parentage, son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark, had placed him on a path that neither sense nor love could fully steer him away from. He saw the realm as a fragile, wounded place in need of a strong hand, and that sense of responsibility fermented inside him, twisting something in his heart. He had tried to rule with the same compassion that once defined him, tried to treat with rebellious lords, tried to offer amnesty to surviving enemies. But again and again, his trust was thrown back in his face. The heart in him that once believed so strongly in second chances was battered. There came a moment, some said it was after a second assassination attempt, some said it was when the last of the Unsullied, loyal to the memory of Daenerys, raised a rebellion in the Stormlands, that something within Jon finally cracked. At first, it was a subtle transformation, but soon it became clear. The man who had once been commander of the Night's Watch, the man who knelt to Daenerys Targaryen for the good of the realm, was gone. In his place stood a king who no longer believed in the illusions of mercy. The small folk began to speak of him in new terms. They whispered that he was becoming the wolf dragon, that once his teeth were bared, there was no one who could stand against him. At court, the scattered remnants of the old houses watched him with anxious awe. He had ghosts on his shoulders. He had dragons in his blood. He had grown quiet, cold, unstoppable. The bannermen of the North remained fiercely loyal, but this new, stern figure alarmed even them. Some said that it was grief and that time would heal him. Others believed that to keep peace across the battered Seven Kingdoms, a harsh hand might be the only sure way. Yet some saw the flickering embers of bitterness behind his eyes, and behind that, something unstoppable. None dared speak too loudly of their misgivings. Not once it became clear how merciless he could be. He remembered each betrayal, He remembered how time and again, kindness was used against him. Now, perched upon the Red Keep's vantage point, he stared out at the ships limping in and out of the harbor. The Crown's business. His business. Jon Snow's face bore lines that had not been there before, and though still young, he looked a man weighed down by decades of suffering. The wind lifted the black cloak around his shoulders, a cloak that in shape recalled the Night's Watch, but in place of the watchful direwolf or the heraldry of the Watch, it was embroidered at the corners with faint threads of Targaryen red. The realm was his, and its burdens overshadowed every shred of the gentleness he had once possessed. He turned to go back inside, his boots heavy on the stone. Word had come from the western hills that House Lannister's surviving loyalists were stirring. Yet another test of his authority, and one that would not go unanswered. He thought of Tyrion, who had once been his friend. Tyrion was gone now, lost in the chaotic battles after Daenerys' death. Some rumored he had fled across the sea. Others said he died in the crypts beneath the Red Keep. No one truly knew, and for his sake, Jon sometimes hoped he had escaped. Yet ironically, with all the great counselors dead or vanished, Jon found himself forced to rely on men and women who had their own agendas or their own ambitions. He scrutinized them all with an unwavering gaze, a quiet suspicion that never seemed to fade. The hallway leading toward the throne room was dimly lit. New torches had been installed, but the Red Keep still felt gutted from the dragonfire of not so long ago. Echoes of footsteps on marble told him that the day's petitioners still waited. No rest for a king whose realm was raw with old wounds. So he composed himself, but the emotion, whether it was anger or sorrow, continued to simmer in his gut. In the throne room, the iron throne glistened darkly. Though battered by dragonfire, the jagged metal seat had been carefully rebuilt, each sword and spike hammered anew to form an imposing silhouette. The sight of it had once turned Jon's stomach. Now it was as much a part of him as Longclaw at his side. Guards flanked the hall, wearing new livery that combined the Stark direwolf and the Targaryen dragon, crimson and gray. It was not lost on anyone how the direwolf's jaws and the dragon's maw seemed to echo each other, as if both were equally fearsome and ready to devour their foes. He took his seat and eyed the small cluster of petitioners. He recognized the first to approach, a lord from the Reach who had sworn loyalty to him only after the Great War ended, a cousin or nephew to one of the Tyrell bastards. He seemed nervous, glancing about the throne room. Jon motioned for him to speak, each motion of the new king measured with the caution of a man intimately aware of betrayals. "My king," the petitioner said, "I come bearing news from the farmland. We are short on seed, short on hands to harvest. The devastation touched every corner, and bandits roam the roads with no fear." Jon listened, his eyes dark as the man described his plight. Once, Jon might have assured him that the crown would dispatch resources, that they would do everything to ease suffering. But he knew half the bandits were former soldiers who had lost their cause, and half the farmland was in ruin thanks to endless wars. And so, quietly, he promised to send men. His men under a strict new order that left no margin for lawlessness. When the man asked if Jon would reduce the taxes for that season, Jon refused in a low, steady voice. "The realm needs coin," he explained. "Walls must be rebuilt, ships must be repaired, and there are armies still waiting to pounce if we show any weakness." The petitioner pleaded softly, for his people had so little left after the wars. Jon's gaze flicked to him, revealing a glint of steel. "None shall starve under my rule if they obey my laws and accept my peace. Yet we cannot forego the realm's needs. I will send provisions, but the taxes remain." The man bowed, and his face was carefully schooled into humility, but Jon heard the undercurrent of despair. He let the man leave without further words. Compassion was too often exploited by the cunning. He had seen the seeds of rebellion sprout from every gesture of mercy. So he sat a moment longer, letting that emptiness settle in him. Had he done the right thing? The old Jon Snow might have tossed and turned over such moral quandaries. But the new king steadied his heart and nodded for the next petitioner. As the hours wore on, Jon eventually returned to his private quarters, thinking of the tasks that would fill the morrow. He dined alone. He often dined alone now, dismissing the would-be courtiers who tried to curry favor. He could not stomach their maneuverings. He felt an ache in his chest as he thought of family. Sansa was in Winterfell, ruling the North as his warden and, in practice, its near-sovereign, though the North had bent the knee. Arya had sailed west. Her letters came rarely, if at all, each word more cryptic than the last. Bran was changed, rumored to be something akin to a mystical hermit now, not part of the realm's daily affairs. Ghost lingered in the courtyards of the Red Keep, uneasy in the southern heat, but refusing to leave Jon's side. He was the last reminder of Jon's old life, perhaps. A silent, white-furred presence. The following morning, Jon rose from a restless sleep with the memory of old nightmares dancing behind his eyes. He did not let them slow him. More petitions, more decrees, each day a test of his rule. Some men tried to measure how far his patience would stretch. They came with bribes, with sly cunning, with alliances that dangled false friendship. Each found a king unwavering, whose justice was swift and often merciless. One minor lord whose men had harassed the crown's road builders was condemned to lose his lands. The man pleaded that he had not known his vassals were behind the trouble. Once, Jon would have been inclined to believe him or at least investigate thoroughly. But rumors said that this lord had been urging others to break away from King's Landing's authority. Jon saw in the man's shifting eyes the echoes of too many others who had once told smooth lies. So he stripped the lord's rights and left him as a landless retainer, turning the property over to more loyal men. The watchers in the throne room realized how quickly the king's judgment fell. There was no second chance. That day, a hush spread among the courtiers. The wolf dragon was not to be trifled with. When the hall emptied, Ser Davos Seaworth, one of the few men Jon still trusted, approached quietly. Davos had grown older, his hair white at the temples, his eyes wise with sorrow. He still served as master of ships, though that was mostly in name. Barely enough ships remained to guard the coasts. Jon did not look up at first. He stared at the flickering shadows that the torchlight cast upon the pillars. Davos cleared his throat gently and gave the king a measured look. "You dismissed that lord quite harshly," Davos said in his soft, reasoned tone. "Might be he had a point. His men could have acted without his knowledge." Jon's expression flickered. "Might be they didn't. I'm done risking the realm on might be." He stood up from the throne, stepping down to join Davos on equal footing. "I appreciate your counsel, Ser Davos, but the time for second chances seems at an end. Every day we wait, the realm bleeds from 1,000 smaller cuts. The bandits gather. The rebellious lords see an opportunity. And if we do not bring a firm hand, the chaos of war creeps back." Davos dipped his head in reluctant acknowledgement. I see it. This realm has been through so much. They need a steady foundation. Yet I worry we risk losing hearts if we cling so tightly." Jon's eyes flashed. "I know these hearts you speak of. They turn on you the moment you show weakness. They turned on me at the wall. They turned on my father in King's Landing so many years ago. They turned on Daenerys when she was stricken with grief. I'll not give them the chance to turn again." He caught the slight sadness in Davos's eyes. The old knight nodded. "Just remember, Your Grace. Sometimes the people do not know they want hope until someone offers it." Jon placed a hand on Davos's shoulder. "I understand, but I won't be undone by illusions. I gave them a chance. Now, they must live by the order I enforce." He left the throne room. Davos's words haunted him a little, but the echo of memory reminded him of the nights he'd lain on the cold ground at Castle Black, the day his own men stabbed him for doing what he believed was right. He thought of the cold splendor in Daenerys' eyes when she realized the world would never love her. He thought of the ring of steel around him as once friends turned foe. Perhaps it was better to be feared than loved, if the love was fickle. And fear had a way of securing loyalty that no vow could truly match. In those early months of his reign, the roads were patrolled by new men sworn to the crown, handpicked from loyal forces. Rumors spread of how they confronted outlaws. Swift, brutal, unyielding. The common folk who had hidden in fear from bandits now breathed a sigh of relief, for at least there was a king who protected them, even if his hand was heavy. Some said it was the ghost of Aegon the Conqueror returned. Others whispered that if the king in the south had grown cold, at least he kept the nightmares at bay. And so a strange quiet settled on the realm, a hush that was not quite peace, nor was it open war. It was a hush that smelled of iron and the faint burn of old cinders. By the time the first new harvest came, the city of King's Landing had begun its slow crawl toward reconstruction. Where entire blocks had been burned by dragon flame, new foundations rose with the crown's coin. Jon did not stint on these efforts. He wanted a capital that would reflect the unstoppable determination he personified. He employed skilled engineers from across the sea, gave generous wages to stonemasons from the north, from the Vale, from the Reach. Bit by bit, the blackened skeleton of King's Landing transformed into a half-skeletal, half-renewed metropolis, no longer the labyrinth of old but something new, with wide thoroughfares and fortress-like gates. It was as though Jon wanted to shape the city into an edifice as unyielding as he had become. The Red Keep, too, saw changes. He had the old secret passages bricked up. Varys's network of hidden ways was sealed or collapsed, for Jon was not eager to let traitors roam unseen. The rumor was that more than a few spies had died in the darkness during those weeks, trapped in the labyrinth beneath the keep as it was sealed. When asked about it, Jon said nothing. The secret tunnels had caused enough pain. Best they be destroyed. If that caused some to vanish, so be it. From Winterfell, Sansa sent letters. The winter snows still lingered, but the north had begun to stir with renewed life. She worried about the slow approach of spring, about tensions with the Ironborn who roamed the coasts. She pressed that the north had not forgotten the sacrifices of the Great War and asked, in her tactful but earnest tone, if the realm was truly being guided with compassion. Jon read her words late one night in the flickering lamplight. He stared at the lines as though they were a riddle. Compassion. He recalled Sansa's face, the set of her jaw, how she had learned politics in Cersei's court. Perhaps she suspected that in King's Landing, the weight of the crown might smother the boy who had once been raised as Ned Stark's bastard. So she was right. But Jon could not find the energy to write back with soft promises or false comfort. He replied only that the realm was secure, that he wished to see the north flourish, that if the Ironborn tested him, they would be met with the same iron as any other foe. He signed it as Jon Targaryen, King of the Undulls and the First Men, Lord of the Seven Kingdoms, Protector of the Realm, and he felt a lingering hollowness as he folded the parchment, thinking that Snow felt more honest, and yet that old name was a ghost. In those days, the nights in King's Landing were eerily quiet. The city's population had shrunk drastically. Curfews were enforced by the Crown's men, who prowled the streets for any sign of unrest. If Jon was restless, he would roam the castle corridors until he found Ghost lying in some corner, ears perked. The dire wolf would lift his large head, and Jon would kneel to scratch Ghost behind the ears. Sometimes the silent presence comforted him. Other times, it only reminded him how far he had come from the boy who had once run about Winterfell's courtyard. The next threat to his throne came from the west. Word arrived that remnants of the Lannister forces, rallied by a surviving cousin and a handful of knights, had seized a fortress near Casterly Rock and declared themselves the rightful rulers of the West. The news was not entirely unexpected. The Lannisters had lost their seat of power when Tywin's direct line crumbled, but there were always minor branches willing to claim the Lion's mantle. Their new leader styled himself Daemon Lannister, though he was little more than a pretender with illusions of grandeur. Jon's counsel urged caution. The men he had left after the Great War were stretched thin. The realm had only begun to breathe again. But Jon, upon hearing the news, stood from his table and looked at the map pinned to the war room's wooden surface. He saw how tenuous the alliances were. If he allowed a spark to flare in the west, it might inspire others. He recalled how, for generations, the Lannisters had been the wedge in the realm's stability or the cornerstone of it. They would always pose a threat unless properly cowed. Jon announced his intention to lead an army westward and personally end this rebellion. The council exchanged glances of unease, for it meant leaving King's Landing after so many months of delicate rebuilding. But Jon was resolute. Within a fortnight, the banners were called up. Soldiers in new tabards, bearing the direwolf Fandragon sigil, marched through the gates of King's Landing, a steady column of steel. Jon rode at the head, clad in blackened armor that reminded some onlookers of his days at Castle Black, yet accented with hints of deep red from his Targaryen bloodline. Ghost loped alongside the vanguard, an unsettling sight for many of the southern knights who had never witnessed a direwolf so large. Ravens carried word to the other lords. The king was on the move, and a hammer was about to fall. The journey west was not easy. The roads were still in disrepair, many a village half empty or turned to rubble. The local folk watched warily from their doors as the king's army passed, uncertain if this would bring new destruction or a path to stability. Jon W., as careful with his men. No looting, no unnecessary cruelty. He would not tolerate a breakdown of discipline. But any slight infraction was punished harshly, a lash or the removal of a hand if the offense was dire enough. Over time, the soldiers learned to keep in strict formation. They whispered that the king's eyes were everywhere. Some said the direwolf carried messages to him when no one was watching. Others spoke of old northern gods that might be listening through the weirwoods. Whatever the cause, the usual lawlessness that accompanied large armies was conspicuously absent. The new discipline held like steel. When they drew near the fortress that Daemon Lannister had seized, the king's outriders brought news of entrenchments, a newly raised banner with the Golden Lion prowling. Daemon's men were few, yet behind strong walls they believed themselves safe. Jon had no illusions. He knew the fortress from old accounts. It was built to withstand a siege for months, but that was if the defenders had provisions and the will to fight on. He also knew that after the Great War, resources were scarce, and petty lords were rarely so loyal when the real might of the crown came knocking. Jon wasted no time. He set up his siege lines, placing archers and scorpions at intervals, ensuring no one would slip in or out. He demanded the fortress open its gates, that Daemon Lannister yield and present himself for the king's justice. Unsurprisingly, the answer was defiance. Daemon, in a taunting letter delivered by a cowering messenger, declared that the seat of the West was his by right and that the Targaryen upstart could go burn in Dragonfire as his ancestor had done. Jon read the letter with a grim expression and burned it in the campfire. He had expected no less. In days past, perhaps he would have tried to negotiate further, to spare bloodshed. But he had learned that half measures achieved nothing. He organized the daily bombardment with scorpions and flaming arrows, harassing the fortress until the walls showed cracks. Then he brought up the new dragon catapults, tools gleaned from old Qyburn's designs. They were monstrous siege engines capable of hurling flaming barrels of pitch or heavy stones at tremendous range. He hammered the walls mercilessly, day and night, ignoring the pleas of some lords who worried about the costly effort. Soldiers began to desert from the fortress, sneaking out under cover of darkness to beg for mercy at Jon's lines. Jon accepted them with stern interrogation. Those who provided valuable information were spared. Those who lied or refused to speak, he executed in front of the others. Soon, he had a steady stream of deserters telling him exactly how many men Daemon Lannister had, how much food was left, which parts of the fortress were weakest. Finally, after weeks of unrelenting siege, with night fires lighting the sky and the fortress battered beyond saving, Daemon sent an envoy. The envoy, a trembling knight with a ragged surcoat, offered terms of surrender. Daemon would hand over the fortress if Jon guaranteed his life and title. Jon refused, unflinching. "There is but one price for treason," Jon said. The envoy ventured to argue, but Jon silenced him with a glare. "Go back and tell your master. Throw open the gates, lay down all arms, and place himself at my mercy. I promise him no harm beyond the punishment for treason." When the envoy left, some of Jon's officers exchanged looks. They knew that the punishment for treason was death, or at best life at the wall. But the wall was no longer the same since the Great War. Much of it lay in ruin, and the Night's Watch was a shadow of its former self, though Jon had sent them some resources. They suspected Daemon's fate was sealed. Sure enough, 2 nights later, men within the fortress mutinied against Daemon. Seeing the hopelessness of their cause, they opened the gates to the king's army. Jon led the charge at the head of his personal guard. Ghost streaked beside him, howling in that deep-throated voice that echoed against the battered stones. The fighting was brief and brutal. Jon's men overwhelmed the few loyalists, who were too exhausted and starved to resist effectively. Jon found Daemon Lannister cornered in a courtyard, sword drawn, defiant to the last. A flicker of old memory surfaced in Jon's mind. How once he'd fought others in hopeless battles, how once he'd admired a man's courage. But he stomped it down. Daemon lunged forward, his sword glinting. Jon caught the blow on Longclaw, the Valyrian steel reverberating with a ringing note. They exchanged several swift strikes. Daemon was young and frenzied, fighting out of pure desperation. Jon, by contrast, moved with calm inevitability. He disarmed Daemon with a twist of his blade that sent the Lannister sword clattering across the courtyard. Daemon fell to his knees, chest heaving, face contorted with fear and disbelief. "Please," he began, trying to stammer out words. "My king, grant me mercy." Jon did not let him finish. He swung Longclaw in a clean arc. Daemon's head tumbled from his shoulders. Blood sprayed across the cobblestones. There was a collective intake of breath from the watchers. A hush, but the deed was done. Jon's expression was unreadable, etched in cold. He did not gloat, he did not rage. He merely wiped Longclaw clean on Daemon's surcoat. Mercy had been swallowed by the realm's endless cycles of violence. This was the only language the realm seemed to understand. That day, the fortress was purged of any who would raise arms against the crown. Those who laid down their arms and pledged loyalty were forced to swear oaths anew, kneeling on the cold stones while Daemon's corpse still lay in the courtyard. Jon listened to each vow with a face carved from ice. He made sure they understood the cost of breaking such oaths. Those who had proven themselves traitors more than once were put to the sword on the spot. When the sun set, the fortress was silent except for the soft crackle of torches and the cawing of distant crows. A strange hush reigned, the hush of a land that had learned to fear its king. Jon left a garrison behind, installing a new castellan sworn to him. Then his army marched back toward the capital unchallenged. The western lords who saw the devastation fell swiftly into line. The message was clear. The wolf dragon would not suffer rebellion. By the time he returned to King's Landing, bards were already spinning half-truths into songs, painting him as a black-clad king who punished treachery with ruthless finality. Some found new pride in that. Others trembled, remembering the old days of Targaryen conquest. It was near the end of that year that Daenerys's last loyalists rose again, this time in Dorne. They had festered underground, outraged at Jon's role in Daenerys's death, even though he had, in truth, never wanted to kill her, and it was not his hand that had turned her mind to vengeance. But that nuance was lost on them. They only saw a Targaryen usurper, half Stark, who had stolen her throne. Dorne was always difficult to subdue, its hot deserts and proud houses known for their independence. And so, as the desert lords began to gather under the banner of a former Stormborn supporter, the realm once more hovered on the cusp of another war. Jon had just concluded a meeting in the Red Keep Solar when the news arrived that a small Dornish host had attacked a crown caravan traveling near the Boneway. The entire caravan was put to the sword. Women, children, merchants, all slaughtered. It was a brazen act of defiance that demanded a response. Jon stared down at the messenger, a young soldier who trembled from both exhaustion and fear. The soldier reported that the Dornish host was led by a man calling himself Oberyn Sand, a supposed bastard son of some minor branch of House Martell. He was rumored to have 1,000 men, well-equipped and well-trained, mostly mercenaries from across the sea. Jon's face hardened at the mention of the slaughter. He dismissed the messenger and strode to the war room, summoning his council. Davos was there, along with a handful of other knights and lords who served as his advisors. They discussed the possible courses of action. Some proposed to negotiate, Dorne had always responded better to compromise than brute force. Others suggested a swift show of arms to scare off the mercenaries. But Jon pointed to the burned caravan. Negotiation will be seen as weakness. We cannot allow any more illusions of leniency. This is beyond a minor raid. They killed innocents in the name of vengeance. We answer with steel. A hush fell. Davos pressed his lips together. They may hide in the sands, strike at our supply lines. We'll need cunning if we're to face them on their terms. Jon's dark gaze flicked to him. Then we adapt. We do what we must. I'll lead the host myself. Gather the men. We ride south soon. They set out before the next moon's turn. The army of the king, as some called it, was smaller than the host that marched west, for many had to remain behind to hold the capital and keep the roads safe. Still, Jon commanded enough men-at-arms to threaten the smaller Dornish force. He also brought archers and knights from the Vale, known for their discipline. Determined, he marched across the Reach, forging alliances with local lords who resented Dornish raids. Some provided additional men, enough to bolster his ranks. The crossing into Dorne was fraught with tension. The scorching sun beat down on the armor-clad soldiers, sapping morale. Water was scarce, the roads hot and dusty. Some in the ranks muttered that no good ever came from crossing the Red Mountains with ill intent. But Jon pressed on, determined to end the threat quickly. He refused to let them slip away into the dunes. Scouts soon brought word that Oberyn Sand's band was encamped near the old fortress of Kingsgrave, a place steeped in the memory of Targaryen invasions past. The fortress itself was not large, but its walls were old and thick, perched atop a rocky ridge that overlooked a narrow pass. As he surveyed the approach, Jon considered the best way to flush them out. He could besiege the fortress, but in the stifling heat of Dorne, that might lead to heavy casualties from thirst and sickness. And a siege might give Oberyn time to slip away or to harass Jon's supply lines. Instead, he planned a bold assault, trusting in the discipline of his men and the advantage of surprise. For all Oberyn Sand's bravado, he was not an experienced general, and his ragtag band might break under a sudden onslaught. Under cover of the night sky, cooled by desert winds, Jon ordered his men forward. Archers took positions among the rocky outcroppings. Infantry formed into disciplined ranks, moving as quietly as they could. The fortress was only lightly guarded, for Oberyn Sand did not anticipate an immediate night attack. When the horns sounded, the Crown's forces flooded the pass, surging toward the gate. A rush of shouts broke the hush of the dunes. Torches flared. Dornish defenders scrambled to respond, but the Vale Knights slammed into them, using heavy shields and tight formations to force them back from the gates. Arrows whistled overhead, some striking down from vantage points in the darkness. Within the first hour, the Crown's forces had captured the outer gatehouse. Oberyn Sand's men retreated into the inner courtyard, where they made a stand. Jon was in the thick of the battle, Longclaw flashing as he cut down any who stood before him. Ghost darted between the swirl of swords, tearing at throats, the direwolf's fur matted with the dust and blood of Dorne. The clash of steel rang out beneath the moon's silver glare. Flames licked from toppled braziers. Men screamed as they died, swords clanged against shields, hoarse war cries split the night. At last, they cornered Oberyn Sand in the fortress's old feast hall. Bodies lay strewn across the flagstones, the stench of spilled entrails thick in the air. Oberyn himself was slender, dark of hair, and wore lightly studded leather. He had 2 curved blades in his hands, and his eyes flashed with fierce defiance. "Targaryen dog!" he spat as Jon approached, dripping sweat and blood. "You betrayed the Queen of Dragons. You should be rotting in the ground, not prancing around with that stolen crown." Jon regarded him, chest heaving, the heat making every breath feel like fire. "The queen you speak of burned thousands alive. I ended her reign of terror. You do not know what you are fighting for." Oberyn snarled. "I fight for vengeance. Blood for blood. The sand snakes, the martels, the ones you let die." Jon did not bother with further talk. He lunged, raising Longclaw in a diagonal slash that Oberyn barely parried with a short blade. Sparks flew. Oberyn twisted, trying to come in under Jon's guard with the second blade. Jon pivoted, stepped to the side. Longclaw slammed into Oberyn's side, cutting through leather, biting into flesh. Oberyn staggered, spitting blood. Still, he fought on, whirling both blades at Jon in a final desperate flurry. Jon caught one with Longclaw's crossguard, the blow jarring his arm, but the second blade hissed toward his neck. He narrowly twisted away, feeling the bite of steel graze his collar, a thin line of red welling just below his ear. Snarling, Jon bashed Oberyn in the face with his pommel. The Dornishman reeled backward, dropping one blade. With a swift motion, Jon drove Longclaw forward, straight into Oberyn's chest. Oberyn gasped, eyes wide, mouth working soundlessly. Jon twisted the sword, yanked it free. Oberyn collapsed in a broken sprawl. He managed one last rasp of breath before life fled him. The hall was quiet now, save for the crackle of distant flames and the moans of the wounded. Outside, the sounds of fighting had subsided. Jon stepped out into the courtyard, where his soldiers stood victorious amidst Dornish corpses. With Oberyn Sand dead, the remainder of his band either surrendered or fled into the desert. Jon let them go, reasoning that the dunes and the punishing sun would deal with the stragglers. He ordered the fortress secured, any wounded loyalists treated, and any Dornish survivors who laid down arms taken prisoner. As for Oberyn's body, he left it where it lay, an unspoken testament to the cost of rebellion. In the weeks that followed, word spread that the King of the Seven Kingdoms had shattered the last significant resistance to his rule. The Dornish lords who might have supported Oberyn Sand quickly sent envoys to treat with Jon, offering hostages and gold to prove their loyalty. Some in Dorne still seethed, but they knew better than to openly defy the wolf dragon. The price was too high, the outcome certain, so they bent the knee, and the realm grew silent again, a silence that felt like the hush before a storm, or the hush that follows a devastating wave. When Jon returned to King's Landing, he carried more scars. One, just below his ear, reminded him how close he had come to Oberyn's blade. But it was the scars inside him that truly throbbed. There had been a moment in the feast hall when, as Oberyn spat fury at him, he recalled the old Jon Snow who once tried to see the best in people, who once tried to broker peace between wildlings and the Night's Watch. Was that man gone forever? Perhaps. He pressed the question down, refusing to dwell on it, for guilt served no purpose. The realm demanded strength. Months turned to a year. Rebuilding continued apace. The roads that led from King's Landing to the surrounding kingdoms were made safe by frequent patrols. Taxes were collected with ruthless efficiency. Jon's gold cloaks, reformed after the old ones had proven corrupt, became a fearsome presence in the city. Tales spread of the king's justice, swift and unyielding. Many common folk found themselves surprisingly grateful. After so much chaos, at least they could walk the streets without fear of outlaws or roving armies. Merchants began to return, commerce flickered back to life. The realm, though still battered, was knitting itself together. But behind every shimmering sign of recovery lay a constant undertone of fear, as if any moment the king's wrath might fall on those who stepped out of line. One evening, Jon received a letter from the north. The large wax seal showed the direwolf of House Stark pressed in white. He broke it open and found Sansa's writing, more urgent now. She spoke of an undercurrent of unease in the north, rumors that the crown had grown too harsh, that the new taxes stung those who could ill afford them. Some lords resented that the so-called king in the south overshadowed the old dream of northern independence. Sansa asked her brother to show more leniency, to remember the northern spirit. She warned that if the crown was too heavy-handed, it might sow the seeds of another uprising, even in the homeland of House Stark. Jon read her words in the quiet of his solar, the candle's flickering light accentuating the lines on his brow. He penned a reply that night, each word chosen carefully. He wrote that he understood the North's concerns, that he trusted Sansa to maintain order, that the crown's demands were necessary to rebuild from the horrors of the war. He reminded her that the others had almost ended the world, and the realm could not risk further fragmentation. At the bottom, he added a curt line, "If they challenge me, they will force my hand." He sealed it with the Targaryen sigil. Once, he might have used the Stark direwolf. No more. In truth, he felt a faint ache in his chest at the thought of turning that cold gaze upon his own home. But the realm came first, or so he told himself. If the North believed they could secede or refuse the taxes demanded by the crown, they would unravel everything. And everything, in Jon's mind, meant the precarious peace he had forged from the rubble of nightmares. He would not allow it. He took to pacing his chambers late into the night, the flicker of torches outside his window. The city was quiet under curfew, but the hush outside felt suffocating. Sometimes, he would pass the old Targaryen tapestries that had been restored in the Red Keep's corridors. Images of dragons scorching fields, kings kneeling in submission. He wondered if he was turning into that old image, a conqueror who united the realm under fear. It left a bitter taste in his mouth, but every time he considered easing his grip, memories of betrayal rose to remind him what mercy had cost. Sansa's letter was not the only sign of strife. The Iron Islands, restless as always, tested his patience by raiding a Lannister port. Jon responded by dispatching ships to blockade Pike, forcing the Ironborn to beg for a truce. Yara Greyjoy, older now, tried to reason that she had not ordered the raids, that they were the acts of a rogue captain. Jon's terms for peace were steep, demanding hostages and punitive reparations. Yara bristled, but she ultimately submitted. The old alliances were undone. All that remained was the reality of the wolf dragon's unstoppable will. More time passed, and the realm settled into a brittle stability. Crops were harvested, trade routes reopened. Whispers in taverns claimed that the new king might be building a navy to rival the old Targaryen fleets, that he might even attempt expansions or new conquests overseas. Others laughed that off, certain that, after so much war, the king would not risk more. But the rumors reflected the tension in the air. The realm was no longer in open conflict, yet the threat of violence hovered like a shadow behind every bit of good news. Jon found himself alone more often than not, walking the corridors of the Red Keep with Ghost or sitting at council meetings where the lords rarely spoke out of turn. He remembered the days at Castle Black when camaraderie had been forced upon them by harsh necessity, forging bonds that transcended petty differences. Now, as king, he was more isolated than ever. Even Davos, who remained a steady hand, could not fully breach the gulf that Jon's transformation had created. They spoke less frequently, and the looks Davos gave him were often tinged with sorrow or concern. In the early spring, a raven arrived from Winterfell with urgent tidings. Sansa had fallen gravely ill, bedridden with a fever that would not break. Jon read the message 3 times, feeling an unusual pang of dread. He had lost so many, not Sansa too. Instantly, he ordered a party prepared. He would ride north at once. The lords in King's Landing tried to protest. The king's presence was needed in the capital, especially with the realm so newly stable. Jon overruled them. He left a regent in place, one of his more reliable bannermen from the Riverlands, and departed with a small escort, traveling swiftly on horseback. For once, there was no large army or show of force. This was a brother anxious for his sister's well-being. The journey took weeks, but the roads were mostly safe now, lined with watchtowers bearing Jon's colors. As he moved north, the air grew colder, the wind sharper, the old pine forests of the neck rising around him. When finally he reached Winterfell, he felt a deep tug in his chest. The old seat of House Stark, his childhood home. The gates opened for him and the guards bowed low. He could see the changes Sansa had made. New ramparts, repairs on the old walls, the courtyard filled with stacked supplies for the coming winter. The people here looked at him with mingled awe and curiosity. He had not returned to Winterfell since before his coronation, and rumors had reached them of his ruthless reign. Sansa was in her bedchamber, pale and weak but awake. When Jon entered, the maester stepped aside quietly. Sansa's tired eyes flickered open. She managed a wan smile. "Jon," she breathed. "You came." He knelt beside the bed, taking her hand gently. Felt clammy and fragile. "Of course I came. The realm can wait." She smiled faintly, then coughed. For a time, they spoke quietly, exchanging words like old friends trying to mend a frayed bond. She asked him about the rebuilding of King's Landing, about the new roads, about trade. He answered in subdued tones, trying to keep the hardness out of his voice. Then she asked him if he was happy. Jon hesitated. "Happiness? I'm not sure any king truly finds that," he said quietly. "I'm doing my duty. That's what matters." She squeezed his hand, her eyes too bright with fever. "Duty is all you have left, isn't it?" He did not reply. The question lingered, painfully accurate. Sansa struggled with her fever for a fortnight. Jon remained by her side much of the time, ignoring the duties piling up. He let the regent in King's Landing handle matters. He needed to be here. For all their differences and distance, Sansa was the closest family he had left. On the nights she was delirious, she'd speak of old memories. Father, mother, Robb, Arya. She cried out for them, her voice trembling with heartbreak. Jon would hold her hand, feeling the old ghost swirl in his own mind. He remembered the day they parted ways all those years ago, a time before war had torn the realm to pieces. Eventually, by the grace of the gods or sturdy northern blood, Sansa's fever broke. She opened her eyes one morning and the clouded film of illness was gone. She was weak, but she was smiling more clearly. Jon felt an odd sense of relief wash over him. He sat at her bedside, telling her that the worst had passed. She nodded, her voice faint. "Thank you for coming." After a moment, she added, "The North still loves you, you know, beneath their doubts. They remember the boy who was a Stark in all but name. I only hope you can remember him too." From time to time, he lowered his gaze. "I remember everything. That's the problem." She studied him with those keen eyes that had learned so much about political cunning. "You can choose a different path, Jon. You don't have to strangle the realm to save it." He gave a small, bitter laugh. If only it were that simple. They spoke no more of it, and in the days that followed, she grew stronger. Eventually, he realized he had to return to King's Landing. The realm might again slip into chaos if he was absent too long. His last conversation with Sansa before departing was tinged with tension. She urged him to remember compassion, to ease off the heavy taxes, to trust the North's sincerity. But he shook his head, telling her that it was not so simple, that the memory of war still loomed, and that the realm could not afford half measures. He wanted to believe there was another way, but in the quiet corners of his heart, he no longer dared. When he finally left Winterfell, a cold wind blew. Ghost bounded beside him, the direwolf's presence a silent reminder of the old life left behind. Sansa stood on the battlements, wrapped in a fur cloak, watching him depart. He did not know if she would ever truly forgive what he had become. Perhaps she did not hate him, but she mourned for him. He felt that grief in her eyes. It haunted him all the way back to the capital. Upon his return, he found that the regent had suppressed a minor revolt in the Crownlands. A group of peasants, hungry and tired of high taxes, had rioted near Rosby. The regent's men had put it down with brutal efficiency, hanging the ringleaders from the gates. Jon felt a flicker of disquiet, but he said nothing. The regent had followed the king's example after all. The only way to maintain order was to make an example of those who rebelled. That night, Jon walked through the corridors of the Red Keep, found his way to one of the new towers that overlooked the city. Standing there, he gazed at the moonlit sprawl of King's Landing. The city glowed faintly with lanterns and torches. Ships dotted the bay. In the distance, he could see the new spires rising where old ones had burned. This was his domain, his achievement. He had wrested peace from the jaws of chaos. And yet, it weighed on him like an iron chain. He clutched the parapet, knuckles white. He remembered the Great War, the swirling snow, the ice-blue eyes of the undead, the horror that nearly took the realm. He had fought it, died for it, sacrificed love and innocence. And here he stood, alive but battered, forging a realm that might survive the next winter, the next threat. Was it worth the cost? Did the end justify the means? He whispered a name, barely audible in the hush, Arya. He wondered if she would even recognize him now, or if she would slip away in the night rather than face what he'd become. He thought of Daenerys, how she once dreamed of breaking the wheel, how power twisted her at the end. Was that same dark coil lurking in him, the Targaryen madness creeping behind his eyes? Or was it simply the cruelty of a wounded heart turned cold by too many betrayals? The lines had blurred. He knew only that the realm needed a strong king, and strong kings did not flinch, no matter the cost. He turned away from the balustrade and descended to his chambers. There, upon a table, sat a map of Westeros, where the old Targaryen kings had once hovered, plotting conquests across the narrow sea. Jon now studied a land that bore his own banner. The wolf dragon, they called him. He traced a finger along the outline of the north, down the neck, past the Trident, to King's Landing, then to the Reach, the Stormlands, Dorne, the Westerlands. He saw in each region the remnants of old hatreds, old loyalties. He had subdued them, but for how long? As soon as the iron grip loosened, new opportunists would rise. It was an endless cycle, war after war. To break it, did he need to break the people themselves? He sank into his chair, exhaustion pooling in his bones. Sometimes, in his dreams, he saw a different path. One where Daenerys had never burned King's Landing. One where Sansa never fell ill. One where the realm came together in genuine unity after the defeat of the others. But that world was not the one he ruled. That world, if it ever existed, was lost to the ravages of chance. Now he had only this realm, and he was its cold, unforgiving guardian. Time marched on. The next year brought more challenges, an outbreak of pox near the Blackwater, a new spate of pirate raids in the Stepstones, an assassination plot uncovered within the Red Keep's kitchens. Jon dealt with each crisis methodically, punishing traitors, rewarding loyalty, ensuring that the realm's structure continued to solidify. Trade caravans from the free cities appeared, drawn by the possibility of profit in a land that was slowly regaining stability. The people, for the most part, lived quiet lives under the watch of the crown's stewards. Their taxes went to building new roads, new harbors, new fortifications. Yet the shadow of fear never quite left. A single rumor of sedition could see a village elder dragged to a courtyard for questioning. And still, the peasants whispered that at least war had not returned. At least the dead were not walking. A fearful peace was better than no peace at all. In court, Jon remained distant. He had no queen. He had no time for the gentle amusements that once gave respite to kings. The lords who came to see him found a monarch as unyielding as stone. He was not cruel for the sake of cruelty. He did not revel in torment or feast on suffering. But his will was iron, and he tolerated no insurrection or compromise when it came to the realm's stability. Some admired it, especially those who benefited from his protection. Others saw only a cold shell of a man who had died once and never fully returned. So it was that late one evening, as Jon sat in the Red Keep Solar, reading reports of the crown's coffers and how best to allocate resources for a new fleet, Ser Davos Seaworth approached for the first private conversation in weeks. Davos had aged further, lines etched deeply in his face. He stood at the threshold, cleared his throat, and then bowed lightly. Jon looked up from the parchments. The candlelight threw dancing shadows across the scar near Jon's ear, reminding Davos of the close call in Dorne. "Your Grace," Davos began, voice quiet, "we have word from the north. The lords are uneasy. Sansa's been doing her best, but they grumble about the taxes, about the size of the crown's new fleet." Jon exhaled and set aside the parchment. "We've been through this. The realm needs the coin for defenses. If the North wants special treatment, they must remember I am their king. The White Walkers might return in another generation or worse. We cannot be caught unprepared." Davos nodded gravely. "You're right, the realm does need to be strong. But the North feels singled out, paying more than their fair share. They're struggling with harvests. Winters come harder there." Jon's mouth tightened. "Are you suggesting I reduce the taxes for them?" I am. Some small measure to show them you've not forgotten your own blood. Let them see you do care for them. It might head off greater trouble in the future." Jon stood, a surge of frustration rising in him. What do they know of trouble? I bled to save the North from the others. I lost everything. My name, my innocence, so that they could live. Davos sighed, shaking his head. You can't expect them to understand it as you do. They see only the burdens of your rule. All I ask is that you consider it. Jon let out a low growl, turning away to pace. Ghost, in the corner, lifted his head at the tension in the king's tone. Finally, Jon halted, scanning the parchments on the table. Very well, he said. I will consider it, but if they take that as a sign of weakness, they will regret it. Davos bowed again. Thank you, Your Grace. When Davos left, Jon sank into his chair, staring at the flickering candle flame. Mercy, compromise, it all felt like an echo of the old Jon Snow. That boy had been stabbed to death. But perhaps, for the sake of the North, for Sansa's sake, perhaps he could bend just a little, if only to prevent the realm from fracturing yet again. Thus, the next royal decree to reach Winterfell declared a modest reduction in taxes for a single season, enough to soothe the immediate complaints without truly damaging the crown's coffers. Word came back that Sansa was relieved, the North placated. She wrote to Jon, I knew the boy I once called my brother was still in there somewhere. Thank you. Jon read her note with a complex swirl of emotions, part warmth, part self-loathing. He set it aside. As the seasons slipped by, that small compromise proved to calm tensions in the North. Meanwhile, in the South, Jon continued to maintain strict order. With no major rebellions, he turned his energy towards strengthening the realm's infrastructure. Granaries were built, new alliances formed with traders from Volantis and Braavos, and he even sent envoys to re-establish ties with Dorne, hoping the bruises of that campaign would fade in time. As all this transpired, the small folk quietly went about their lives. Some praised the king who, though stern, had ended war and built roads. Others muttered curses under their breath, remembering the families who had been hanged for minor acts of defiance. But none could deny that the Seven Kingdoms were united under a single ruler in a way not seen since before Robert's rebellion. On the anniversary of the Great War's end, Jon decreed a day of remembrance for all who had fallen at the Long Night. Pyres were lit, from Winterfell to Dorne at twilight. He stood upon the Red Keep's walls, watching the flames flicker across the city's rooftops. A hush seemed to fall over the streets as the bells tolled. The memory of that night of ice and death weighed heavy on everyone who had survived. Jon closed his eyes, recalling the frantic battle at Winterfell, the shrieks of wights, the swirl of snow, the relentless onslaught. He remembered his father's words, that when the snows fall and the white winds blow, the lone wolf dies but the pack survives. So many wolves had died, yet the realm survived. The cost was immeasurable, and the man who stood here now was hardly the same. After the bells fell silent, Jon descended to the throne room, where he had arranged a small ceremony for the lords and ladies currently in the capital. They knelt or bowed as he entered. He took his seat on the iron throne, each step resonating in the hush. He had them light 7 candles in memory of the fallen. One for the North, one for the Vale, one for the Riverlands, one for the Westerlands, one for the Reach, one for the Stormlands, and one for Dorne. Each candle flickered with a fragile glow, an apt reminder of the life that had once nearly been snuffed out. He offered a brief speech, his voice echoing in the high vaults. We came together to survive the long night, remember what we lost, and remember that only unity can keep the darkness from swallowing us again. Many of those present were moved, reminded of why they had once followed Jon Snow. A few, though, looked at the row of heads on spikes outside the city gates, remnants of traitors executed months or years before, and wondered if this was truly unity or fear. But none dared voice dissent. The king in the south had made his stance clear. When the ceremony concluded, Jon lingered alone in the hall. He approached the candles, watching the small flames dance. His reflection in them seemed haunted, the flickering light revealing lines of sorrow, scars, and something akin to longing for what might have been. He thought of all the roads not taken. He thought of a life beyond the wall, free from the shackles of power. He thought of Samwell Tarly, parted from him long ago, who once believed in books and knowledge as the path to a better world. Sam was out there somewhere, rebuilding the citadel or perhaps caring for Gilly and her child. Would he recognize Jon now? He closed his eyes, letting the hush of the throne room envelop him. He had chosen this path, or it had chosen him. Either way, he was king now, and the realm needed a strong pillar upon which to rest, even if that pillar bore the brunt of its own weight in endless solitude. In the passing years, that hush of fear and order became the new normal. The wolf dragon reigned, unchallenged, and though there was still the occasional revolt or bandit lord, each was swiftly crushed. The Seven Kingdoms, battered by wars and near apocalypse, found a strange measure of prosperity beneath the iron will of Jon Targaryen, the once bastard who had defied death itself and claimed destiny's seat. Outsiders marveled at how quickly the realm recovered. They heard rumors of the king's severity, but also of his achievements in restoring roads, rebuilding fleets, encouraging new trade. They called him cunning, strong, unstoppable. The people of Westeros learned to live with the heavy taxes and the watchful eyes of the crown's men, trading freedom for security. Some lived well under this arrangement, especially merchants and artisans who thrived in the relative stability. Others, especially in rural areas, chafed under a monarchy that seemed distant and unyielding. But rebellion did not stir in the open. No one wanted to face the fate of Daemon Lannister or Oberyn Sand. And so a generation grew up with only secondhand stories of the War of the Five Kings, the Targaryen queen who burned the city, and the Night King's undead legion. That all belonged to the old world, now replaced by the reign of the wolf dragon. Jon himself grew quieter and more withdrawn with each passing year. He had expected that eventually he would take a wife, secure the Targaryen line, produce heirs. But the scars of loss and betrayal burned in him. Daenerys, Ygritte, all those he had loved and lost. The idea of opening his heart again felt impossible. He postponed the topic whenever it arose, ignoring the lords who pressed him to choose a bride. Occasionally, a bold lady or a foreign princess came to court with hopes of enticing the king. He remained unmoved. A hush accompanied him wherever he went, as if the walls themselves knew that love had no place in his life. In truth, at night, he sometimes dreamed of the old days at Winterfell, the laughter of siblings, the bark of the dogs, the swirl of snow in the courtyard. Then he would awaken in a cold sweat in the Red Keep, the weight of the crown pressing down on him. Duty was the only anchor he had left, and duty demanded that he remain strong and ruthless. So the realm endured, shaped by his iron hand. The small folk prayed for good harvests, for mild winters, for no more war. The lords turned their energies to building up their lands, jockeying for influence at a court that rarely rewarded fawning, but demanded absolute loyalty. Beyond the borders, foreign nations took cautious notice. Some saw an opportunity in Westeros's resurrection, others a threat. Braavos courted trade, Volantis sent ambassadors. Jon entertained them briefly, measuring them with the same cold gaze he gave his own lords. The hush persisted, a hush thick with memory and fear. And Jon Snow, no, Jon Targaryen, the wolf dragon, sat upon the Iron Throne, carved from the swords of 1,000 conquered foes, forging a realm that remembered what it was like to stand at the brink of extinction. If Westeros had once prayed for a savior king, it found instead a lonely guardian, too burdened by the cost of survival to ease his grip. The realm prospered in many ways, yet, in hidden corners, men and women wondered if the flame of hope had died with the old Jon Snow who once believed in mercy and second chances. But perhaps the realm no longer needed hope, only order. Perhaps it was enough that a final peace, tenuous though it might be, kept the nightmares at bay. And so day by day, year by year, the hush continued. Tales were told of the king who had once been a bastard, who had faced death and risen to rule with neither mercy nor malice, only the unyielding determination that no new war or monstrous threat would ever again tear Westeros apart. And in that hush, the memory of love slowly faded, replaced by the iron echo of duty fulfilled at any cost. But in that hush, life in the Seven Kingdoms went on, day after day, season after season. In every corner of Westeros, from the Arbor's gentle vineyards to the frosty peaks of the Frostfangs, the people either adapted to the new rule or shrank beneath it. Jon's court in King's Landing fostered a measure of learning again. Maesters traded scrolls on rebuild techniques, stonemasons offered new ideas for fortifying walls, foreign healers spoke of advanced treatments for the recurring pox. Many smaller blessings and seeds of renewal sprouted, overshadowed though they were by the weight of fear. A well-ordered realm, many said, if an unsmiling one. Yet under the surface, 1,000 hidden tensions awaited the right spark. The faith, left diminished after years of warfare and conflict with the crown, now sought to rebuild its influence. The High Septon, a moderate man carefully appointed during Jon's reign, walked softly, mindful that the wolf dragon would not brook sedition disguised as prayer. Still, ordinary worshippers whispered that more should be done to restore the great September of Baelor, whose bones remained even after the savage destruction by dragonfire under Daenerys. They pressed the crown for gold, for workers, for blessings. Jon allocated some funds. He understood that the faith was a pillar too, but it was never enough for the devout. Quiet murmurs grew that the crown poured far more coin into building roads and warships than into the faith's houses. An undercurrent of resentment glimmered among fervent believers. They asked if it was right that the king who claimed to protect all neglected the cradle of their worship. For now, it was only talk, hushed by the memory of past conflicts. But small embers sometimes burn hottest in secret. Meanwhile, whispers of the king's personal life circulated in the courts of lesser lords. Would he ever marry? Would there be heirs? What would happen if the wolf dragon died childless? Some conjured images of a dreadful succession crisis. Others, more pragmatic, thought that if the monarchy passed peacefully to Sansa Stark or some other relative, it would be the same iron rule in a different shape. Still, for the ambitious, there was a tempting chance. If the king had no official family, no spouse or children, perhaps a distant Targaryen branch or a newly minted dynasty might find a way to claim the throne. Vultures in velvet waited in the shadows. One evening, in the 5th year of Jon's reign, a woman arrived at King's Landing with a claim that set tongues wagging. She called herself Elora Stormborn, insisting she was a lost Targaryen of some Byblo lineage, sworn to avenge Queen Daenerys. She brought with her a small retinue of Associ Sellswords, ragtag and flamboyant, weaving stories about hidden dragon eggs, about magic and prophecy. The city's gates nearly refused her entry, but she bribed enough guards to slip through. Soon, she and her companions performed street corner theatrics, shouting that the wolf dragon was an imposter, that the true Targaryen line must be resurrected in memory of Daenerys Stormborn. Most people scoffed. They remembered the devastation of Dragonfire too well. Also, the king's men had no patience for such sedition. Within days, the gold cloaks dragged Elora Stormborn and her retinue before the royal court. They were bruised, dusty, but still defiant. Jon sat on the Iron Throne, expression unreadable as the would-be Targaryen knelt below. The watchers in the hall felt tension coil like a spring, waiting for the king's verdict. "My king," she began, struggling not to spit the words. "I am Elora Stormborn. My mother was said to be a cousin of Daenerys Targaryen, hidden away in Essos. I have come to lay claim to—" "Silence," Jon said, the single word cutting the air. His voice was low but resonant. He had grown skilled at compressing an ocean of meaning into short commands. She clenched her jaw, but her eyes still burned with the fervor of someone convinced of her own importance. The hall was so quiet that the drip of a leaky window high above echoed in the stillness. "Claiming Targaryen blood in order to sow rebellion," Jon said. "For that alone, I could send your head rolling." Elora lifted her chin. "You dare call me a rebel? You who usurped Daenerys' rightful throne. You who—" The king raised a hand, and half a dozen guards seized her, forcing her to her knees again. Gasps rippled among the courtiers. There was no flicker of recognition in Jon's face. He looked at her not like a long-lost Targaryen kin, but more like a splinter to be plucked out. Though he was half Targaryen by blood, that heritage was no shield for those who claimed it falsely or used it to challenge him. He turned to the assembled lords. Does any here believe her claim? Let them speak freely, now in my presence. He let the question hang. None spoke. Even the ones who might harbor conspiracies in their hearts were too terrified to do more than stare at the floor. Jon turned back to her. Your mother? A cousin of Daenerys Targaryen? If that were so, the records in the Citadel would have some mention. Show me your proof, letters, testimonies from recognized maesters, any shred of evidence. His gaze pinned her like a hawk's talons. Her cheeks flushed. We traveled in secret. The House Targaryen has been hunted since Robert's rebellion. Evidence was lost. He stared a moment more, then nodded curtly. Of course. He rose from the Iron Throne, that simple motion stirring the black cloak about his shoulders. You come before me with no proof, only words. You incite sedition in my streets. You claim the Stormborn name to stoke the hatred of those who once followed Daenerys. He paused to let the tension coil. Then, take her to the dungeons. Try her for treason. Alora Stormborn thrashed in the guard's grip. Treason? My very blood is the rightful line. Jon's expression did not even flicker. I am Targaryen blood, recognized by the lords of Westeros and by the legacy of Rhaegar. You are no one. She shrieked in fury as they dragged her away, her retinue with her. None who watched were surprised. All expected that soon she would join a line of traitors, or at best, vanish into a black cell. Yet some in the corners whispered that the king did not even grant her a trial in open court. He had effectively condemned her from the start. To them, it was another sign. The king would not permit even the slightest echo of a competing claim. Within a week, the dungeons swarmed with rumors. Alora's shrieking defiance, her cell's words cursing the crown, the hush of torture behind locked doors. Then the day came when her cell door was opened, and she was led, half mad with bruises, into a cramped hearing presided over by the Master of Laws. The verdict was swift, guilty of sedition and false claims. Her sentence, death before the city's great September ruins, where Daenerys' conquest of King's Landing had culminated in so much blood. Some of the king's men thought it fitting she should die on the very stones scorched by the mother of dragons she claimed to revere. Jon did not personally attend the execution. He had grown to find such spectacles unnecessary. Let the realm see that traitors were dealt with severely. He did not need to watch. By midday, Alora's headless body dangled from a spike, and her cell's words were strung beside her, their corpses a warning for all. Some looked upon this and shuddered. Others, especially those who had lived through the reign of the Mad King and then the bloodshed of the War of Five Kings, shrugged. That was the Game of Thrones. Speak against the ruler, pay with blood. In the Red Keep that evening, Jon sat in quiet conference with his small council. Ser Davos spoke of the incident in a measured tone. It's done, Your Grace. She's no threat now. He paused, swallowing. It might have been wise to at least pretend to investigate her claim in more detail, to give her a fair hearing, if only to quell rumors that we silence any voice at all. Jon's face was a carved mask. She was stirring rebellion. No fair hearing would satisfy those who cling to that cause. Better to cut it out at the root. Westeros has had enough pretenders. Davos nodded heavily. He had grown used to such answers. Aye, so it goes. Not far from Davos sat a new master of whispers, a lean woman named Rissala who had once served as a scribe in Old Town and somehow risen through cunning and espionage. She shuffled parchments with careful hands. We have word from Bravos, she said. They worry about your new fleet. They suspect you might soon have the ships to rival their trade galleys. They're sending an envoy to treat with us. Jon's posture stiffened fractionally. Let them come. We seek no quarrel. But we will not leave the seas open to raiders or pirates who threaten our shores. She nodded. They will arrive within a moon's turn. I will watch them closely. Jon gave a curt agreement. Next item. The Master of Coin droned about finances, Collections were up from certain territories, though sickness in the Westerlands had reduced some returns. There was talk of forging new silver currency with the wolf-dragon sigil, a symbolic demonstration of unity under the king. Jon approved the plan, if only to ensure that merchants had a stable currency. Bit by bit, he was knitting together a realm that remembered past chaos. A realm that now had no illusions about who wielded the final authority. When the meeting adjourned, Davos lingered. He waited until the others left, then approached Jon with a hesitant step. "Your Grace," he said quietly, "there is news from the north. Lady Sansa has taken ill again. The maester at Winterfell says it is not as dire as her last bout, but she's bedridden." Jon's jaw clenched. He felt a flicker of something: worry, fear, sorrow. "Has the maester asked for more help? More supplies?" "Yes, but more importantly, Sansa has asked for you." That subtle line etched between Jon's brows deepened. He remembered the last time he'd ridden north to her sickbed. The realm had tottered for weeks in his absence, but the thought of ignoring her summons tightened his chest. She was his sister, or as close as one could be. She was his only true link to House Stark, to that old life. "I cannot simply leave the capital again. I will write to her, send the best maesters from the Citadel if need be." Davos studied him. "Forgive me, but she might need more than a letter. This could be her last wish, for all we know." Jon's fingers curled around the back of his chair. The easy solution would be to say no, but he could not bear the idea of Sansa dying alone, or feeling that he had abandoned her. "Arrange an escort," he said after a moment. "I will depart within the week." Davos bowed and left him alone in the solar, where candlelight flickered over the table's surface. Jon stood there, staring at the map of Westeros pinned to a board on the far wall. His gaze traveled from the Crownlands up the King's Road, through the Neck to the north. How many times had he made that journey, in war or in hope? Perhaps once more would not break him. Yet part of him wondered if he could trust the capital's uneasy quiet while he was gone. He would appoint Davos as regent, but he had learned the realm's tendency to sprout troubles in a king's absence. Still, to refuse Sansa's plea was unthinkable. Within days, the retinue was arranged. Jon left a garrison strong enough to deter any opportunists. Davos was given a sealed letter of regency, granting him authority over daily affairs, though major decisions were to wait if possible. Then, with a small company of loyal knights, Jon rode out of King's Landing. It had been years since he last traveled north, and the King's Road felt both familiar and strange under his horse's hooves. This time, the small folk along the way greeted him more tentatively. They knelt or bowed, but with eyes that revealed more wariness than warmth. Word of his ruthless judgments had traveled far. Still, he encountered no overt hostility. The roads were in good repair, patrolled by crown men in tabards of direwolf and dragon. Banditry had faded over the years thanks to his unyielding crackdowns. Farmers worked their fields in relative peace, at least when they were not complaining of taxes. Small villages in the Riverlands were slowly regrowing, scars of old battles turning into fields of half-wild flowers. Smoke curled invitingly from chimneys. Children scrambled in the dirt or stared wide-eyed as the king passed. He tried to feel pride that the realm was, at last, somewhat mended. But all he felt was a dull acceptance. Of course it must be so, for anything else would be an invitation to chaos. They pressed on, forging over the Neck and into the north's chilly air. The shift was palpable. Trees grew taller, pines darker, the sky more expansive. By the time they reached the outskirts of Winterfell, the wind carried the promise of oncoming cold, and gray clouds churned in the sky. It was as though the gods of the north recognized an old son returning, but they did not decide whether to greet him kindly or not. Sansa was awake when he arrived, though propped against pillows, her face pale. The lines on her brow betrayed pain, but her eyes lit up when she saw him. Jon had no crown on his head. He had left it behind, finding the metal circlet tiresome to wear on the road. He knelt by her bedside as before, though an older maester hovered in the background, and a cluster of northern lords waited in the corridor, anxious for news. She squeezed his hand. I'm sorry to have summoned you, she whispered, her voice fragile as old parchment. But I feared if I didn't, I might not see you again. He pressed her hand gently. I would have come anyway if I'd heard you were ill. Her lips quirked. That is kind, Jon. But I know the burdens you bear. He managed a small nod. How long have you been like this? She drew in a breath. The fever came 2 weeks ago. It has lessened, but I feel so weak. The maester thinks it may pass, or it may linger for months. My health is no longer strong. That much is clear. He said nothing, only running his thumb over her knuckles. It felt like glass under his grip, delicate and easily broken. A swirl of emotions flared in him. Anger at the gods for afflicting her, guilt that she was forced to bear the North's responsibilities while he reigned in distant King's Landing, sorrow that she might slip away as so many others had. She asked about the city, about the state of the realm. He answered with measured words. Yes, the 7 kingdoms were at peace. Trade was blossoming. There had been uprisings, each quelled swiftly. Taxes were high but necessary. He saw the slight crease of concern between her brows and stopped short of mentioning the new line of traders' heads that occasionally adorned city gates. Let her keep some illusions if it eased her rest. You've done what needed doing, she said softly, as though reading his mind. But sometimes I worry what it's doing to you. I fear for your soul, Jon. He gently set her hand down on the bed's coverlet. I lost my soul a long time ago. This is duty now. She closed her eyes, pained. You are more than that. You must be. He offered no reply. What else could he say? He had chosen the path he believed was necessary. He had shed mercy, except in fleeting moments when he allowed a slight loosening. The North might call him brother, but he knew that behind polite loyalty, many of its lords questioned the severity of the crown's rule. Maybe that was as it had to be. He lingered with her, ensuring she had warmth, good nourishment, everything the best maesters could provide. For a time, it almost felt like the old days, 2 Starks in Winterfell. But the illusions shattered each time he glanced in the mirror of her bedchamber and saw not a bastard boy but a hard-eyed king. Several days passed. Sansa's fever wavered, drifting in and out. Sometimes she seemed almost recovered, smiling faintly as she nibbled at bread or sipped strong northern ale. Other nights, Jon found her shaking violently, maesters fussing at her side, trying to bring the fever back down. He spent many hours pacing the corridors of Winterfell, the old stones steeped in memory. Ghosts trotted at his side, sniffing corners with half-recognition. The dire wolf was older too, muzzle grayer, scarred from the many battles alongside Jon. Servants avoided them, uncertain how to address the king in these quieter halls. On the 6th night, a lord named Hally's Serwin asked for an audience. Jon stood in the solar with Sansa's castellan, an older man who wore the Stark sigil on his tabard. Lord Serwin arrived with all courtesy, bowing deeply, his cloak of dark wool trailing on the rushes. "My king," he said, "I beg pardon for disturbing you at such an hour." Jon flicked his gaze. "Speak." Serwin hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "We in the North have begun to resent a new wave of taxes demanded by your men these last 2 months. Is it truly necessary? We have always been loyal. Our harvest was poor this year, and though we do not seek to refuse our obligations, we fear we cannot pay without condemning some of our folk to hunger." Jon's jaw tightened. He recalled signing a new tax measure back in King's Landing, an attempt to raise coin for finishing the grand rebuilding of the Dragon Pit, as well as adding to the navy. "I understand your concern, but the realm as a whole must be fortified. We cannot rely on old, crumbling structures if new threats arise. The North must do its part." Serwin shifted from foot to foot. "We would do our part gladly, but we ask for relief this season. Otherwise, we might have to cull livestock early, or force new levies on our small folk." "Then do so," Jon cut in. "There is no other way. I gave the North a reprieve once. You cannot expect it indefinitely. If you are loyal, you will comply." An uneasy silence followed. Serwin's face fell, but he tried to maintain composure. "Aye, your grace, but the small folk. I cannot have separate rules for every region, Jon said coolly. Do you think the Riverlands would not welcome a reprieve? The Reach, battered by old wars, might also beg for lighter burdens. And then how do we pay for the ships and the roads that keep us all safe? No, Lord Serwin, your petition is denied. You'll collect the taxes as decreed. Lord Serwin's lips parted, perhaps to protest, but he saw no room for argument in the king's hard expression. Bowing, he muttered, "As you say, I shall obey, my king," and made his retreat. The Castellan, a loyal retainer of House Stark, let out a small breath once Serwin was gone. "He is a good man," he said quietly. "He lost 2 sons in the Great War. He's only trying to keep his people fed." Jon's mouth was a flat line. "I'm sorry, but if we let the North set the precedent of lesser taxes, the entire realm will unravel. You know how fragile the kingdom remains under its surface." The Castellan dipped his head. He knew better than to argue. The king's word, after all, was law. Still, he felt the chill that was not entirely from the northern air. That night, Jon took a turn through the sea. Artyard, breathing in the crisp winter wind. Overhead, the sky was awash in stars. He remembered standing in that courtyard as a boy, sword in hand, hearing Ser Roderick's advice. Ned Stark's voice echoed in the stone, telling him that the man who passes the sentence should swing the sword. He had lived by that for a time. But now, passing sentence meant condemning entire villages to hunger, if need be, for the sake of the realm's greater good. He exhaled, watching the vapor swirl from his mouth. Was he still following his father's code, or had he twisted it into something else? He turned back toward the keep. Sansa needed him, but so did the realm. A day later, he decided he could not remain indefinitely. Her health stabilized slightly, enough that she could sit up and speak without much strain. When he told her of his plan to leave, she nodded with resigned understanding. "Be well," she said, her voice a thread. "Write to me. I hope to visit King's Landing when I regain my strength." He squeezed her hand. "Rest. Let the maesters do their work." She offered a faint smile. "Jon, it doesn't have to be like this. The realm can be strong without the iron grip. The people." He looked away, jaw tightening. "I can't risk it. We nearly died once as a people. I won't let that happen again." She lowered her eyes, sadness pooling in them. "I know you believe that, but it's killing you, bit by bit." He kissed her forehead gently, something he had not done since they were children. "Goodbye, Sansa." She closed her eyes against tears. "Goodbye, my brother." He departed Winterfell with his escort at dawn. Outside the gates, a handful of northern lords watched him go, their expressions subdued. He noticed Lord Serwin's face among them, polite but taut with frustration. Jon felt a pang of foreboding in his gut, but he brushed it aside. The realm had tested him many times. One more discontented lord would not undo everything. As they rode south, the winter wind at their backs, Ghost loped alongside. More than once, Jon caught himself gazing over the northern horizon, wondering if this was the last time he would see Sansa alive. If so, was their farewell truly so final? He felt the old ache of regrets. But the king's burdens did not allow him to linger in sentiment. Duty, always duty, carved him hollow. By the time he returned to King's Landing, the Braavosi envoy had arrived, setting up in lavish apartments. Davos, acting regent, filled Jon in on the details. The envoy was led by a Sea Lord's daughter, Lady Myrina Anteryen, who offered potential trade pacts and wanted to gauge how far the king meant to extend his ship's reach. Jon washed away the dust of travel, donned his black and red attire, and prepared to meet them in the throne room. Lady Myrina was a poised woman in her middle years, draped in the exotic silks of Braavos. She swept a graceful bow before the Iron Throne, her retinue behind her. Her accent was thick with the rolling cadence of the free cities, but her common tongue was polished. "Your Grace," she greeted him. "It is an honor to stand in your rebuilt hall." Jon watched her keenly. He had learned to read the posture of foreign envoys. This one was calm, confident, neither haughty nor subservient. Lady Myrina, welcome. I trust your journey was uneventful. Indeed, though your roads are well guarded. My compliments on maintaining order. Her dark eyes flicked around the throne room, noting the hush of courtiers. She glimpsed the guards in their black livery, the banners half-lit by torches. We come with a proposal. Braavos is always keen to expand trade. We hear you have new fleets. Perhaps it is time for a formal alliance of shipping routes, so that both Braavos and Westeros might flourish. Jon inclined his head. I'm open to hearing your proposals, but we will not sign away our sovereignty in exchange for privileges that favor Braavos alone. We remember how the Iron Bank once meddled in our affairs. She offered a delicate smile. The Iron Bank is a separate entity, as you must know. They have their own deals outside the purview of the Sea Lord. My interest is purely in fostering commercial ties. We will pay fair coin, share certain technologies, guarantee Braavosi ships do not interfere with Westerosi trade. In return, we ask for lowered tariffs, the right to establish a Braavosi quarter in King's Landing, and perhaps a small presence in your new harbor to oversee shipping logs. Jon listened, expression stony. It sounded like the beginnings of a typical free city foothold, the seeds of foreign influence. He was cautious by nature, but also recognized the realm's need for new trade partners. There was no ignoring the benefit of Braavosi silver. Let us negotiate details in private, he said. My master of coin and master of ships will join me. We can discuss terms. She bowed graciously. I look forward to it. Thank you, your grace. The next days were a flurry of negotiations. Lady Myrina proved skillful, but found her match in Ser Davos, who, for all his humble background, had grown adept at the intricacies of maritime trade. He hammered out details, ensuring Westeros's advantage. Jon mostly listened, interjecting with final decisions. Despite the tension and caution, a workable treaty began to take shape. The Braavosi would be allowed a small presence in King's Landing's harbor district, a set number of warehouses to handle goods from Essos. Tariffs would be lowered but not abolished. In return, Braavosi shipbuilders would help modernize the Westerosi fleet with new designs, and Braavos guaranteed to respect Westerosi shipping lanes without imposing special fees. Jon was aware that an alliance with Braavos would bring new wealth into the realm, more diverse goods, more opportunity for the small folk to work in the bustling harbor. It might also open a door for foreign spies. But that was the cost of doing business in the wide world. He signed the final documents with a heavy sense of inevitability. This was how a realm grew strong, forging pacts that served mutual interests, building up an economy that matched his army's strength. If that meant some infiltration, well, he had his own spies. He would remain vigilant. When the treaty was publicly announced, merchants across King's Landing cheered. Ports like Duskendale and Gulltown sent messages of approval, hoping to benefit from side deals. Only a few more isolationist voices grumbled about letting foreigners have even a toehold in the capital. Jon dismissed such concerns. He had no illusions about the world. If Westeros did not engage, others would force themselves in. Meanwhile, from the west, news arrived that the Lannister cousins who had sworn fealty after Daemon's failed rebellion were quarreling among themselves over newly discovered gold veins in old mines near Casterly Rock. One faction accused the other of hoarding the discovery from the crown. Jon sent royal agents to investigate. Word came back that the gold was indeed quite substantial, and the Lannisters had hidden it to avoid paying their share to the Iron Throne. Jon did not hesitate. He dispatched a contingent of crown soldiers to seize the mines, forcibly placing them under direct crown control. The Lannister lords howled, but they had no recourse. The wolf dragon would not be cheated. He made an example of their ringleader, stripping him of lands and titles, redistributing them to a minor branch of Lannisters who showed more loyalty. Thus, the West was again reminded that treachery held a steep price. It was a pattern repeated throughout the realm. Whenever a house stepped out of line, Jon put it back in place with swift, methodical punishment. If a region found gold or silver, the crown took its lion's share. If a harbor grew prosperous, the crown demanded a portion for the royal fleet. Over time, Some in the small council quietly questioned whether the realm was being squeezed too tightly. Yet no one challenged him openly. They remembered what happened to those who tested him. One night, Ser Davos came to Jon in private again, the flickering braziers casting dancing shadows on the stone walls of the king's solar. "Your Grace," Davos said, respectful but weary. "A letter from Lord Serwin of the North arrived today." He paused, obviously uneasy. "He claims that your new tax collectors have been heavy-handed in their methods. Some speak of intimidation, even the threat of violence if quotas aren't met. He begs leniency." Jon closed his eyes, leaning back in his chair. He pictured Serwin's face at Winterfell, that subdued worry. "I said they would comply," Jon muttered. "If they won't, the collectors must do what's needed to enforce the law." Davos's lips thinned. "They are collecting, but the peasants suffer. Serwin warns that it may drive the folk to desperation. There are rumors of small gatherings in the woods, talk of refusing to pay. He hints that if the crown pushes further, rebellion might fester. Perhaps a lightening of the burden is wise." Jon's gaze snapped up. "Rebellion in the north? I left them in peace for years. I even gave them a season's reprieve once. Must I again? How many times before the rest of the realm clamors for the same? No, tell him the tax stands. The north bleeds no more than any other region." Davos exhaled. I will send that message, but I fear we are fueling anger that could ignite." Jon rose from his seat, staring at the war map pinned to the wall. The candlelight made his shadow loom, as if some great beast hovered. "Then let them ignite. I've had enough of these half measures. If the North cannot pay a fair share, they can face the consequences. I will not see the realm undone by pockets of defiance." Silence lingered. Davos's voice was hushed. "They are your people, Jon." Jon's shoulders tensed, hearing his name from Davos's lips. "They are the realm's people. My duty is to all the 7 kingdoms, the North included. If they prefer defiance, I'll meet them with steel." Davos dipped his head. "As you command. I only hope it doesn't come to that." Within the week, riders bore the king's unsympathetic response back to the north. Jon tried to dismiss the matter from his mind, focusing on new tasks. The Braavosi presence in King's Landing increased, filling the harbor with vibrant color and foreign tongues. People said the city had not been this lively in decades. Meanwhile, new roads to the Stormlands were underway, bridging old ravines to connect outlying hamlets. Everything was moving forward, a realm on the mend. Yet the king's gaze turned northward with flickers of doubt. The next sign of trouble came from none other than Lady Brienne of Tarth. She arrived one morning at the city gates, seeking an audience. She was older now, hair shot with gray, face etched with lines of care. Once a sworn shield to Sansa Stark, she had parted ways in the aftermath of the Great War, traveling for a time, then returning to Tarth to oversee her father's lands. The guards recognized her immediately, for her legendary status had not faded. When she was admitted to the throne room, Jon found the memory of her younger self stirring. She had once stood for honor, an unwavering knight. If she had come this far, it was with a purpose. He motioned for her to rise from her bow, ignoring the faint whispers of the courtiers at the sight of the tall, imposing woman in battered armor. "Lady Brienne," Jon greeted. "What brings you back to King's Landing?" She stood square, posture stiff with sincerity. "Your Grace, I come with pleas from Sansa Stark. She summoned me from Tarth with a letter, requesting my aid. The North grows restless under the taxes. There have been rallies in hidden glens, scattered talk of open defiance. Lady Sansa is recovering but remains too weak to travel extensively. She fears a confrontation. She hopes you might show mercy." Jon's face was unreadable. "She already wrote to me through official channels. My answer was no." Brienne's lips pressed tight. "If these taxes continue, more lords will question your rule. Sansa does not seek rebellion, but she fears that those who do might slip beyond her control. Some houses remember the old days, the king in the north, free of southern demands. She begs you to reconsider." Jon felt a surge of anger at the persistent demands for special treatment. He also felt a stab of guilt. The realm must remain united. I can't have the North exempt from the burdens everyone else bears. Brienne met his gaze, unwavering. What if you negotiated a different arrangement for them? A lower coin tax in exchange for more soldiers or more raw materials? The North has timber, fur, iron. They can pay in kind, lessening the burden on their small folk. Jon paused. He had not considered that. He turned it over in his mind. The realm could use iron shipments for weapons or wood for ships, furs for trade. Perhaps that might be a workable compromise. But the memory of repeated pleas for leniency made him bristle, suspecting it might be a trap. If he gave the North an alternative, would other regions demand the same? He glanced down at the throne's jagged metal arm. I will consider it, he said at last, though his tone was non-committal. But I make no promises. Brienne looked relieved at even that faint hope. Thank you, Your Grace. She lingered in the capital for days, evidently hoping to glean a final answer. Jon instructed Ser Davos and the council to review the possibility of substituting taxes with goods from the North. The discussions were tense. The Master of Coin warned that coin was critical for paying the crown's debts to the Iron Bank, for building the new warships. Replacing some with raw materials might complicate those arrangements. But Davos pointed out that consistent shipments of iron and timber could allow the crown to produce more of its own resources, ultimately saving coin. At least it was an idea that might soothe the North's discontent. Jon weighed it carefully. On a chilly morning, he summoned Brienne to a private solar and gave his answer. Tell Sansa and the Northern Lords that I will accept shipments of iron and timber equal in value to half their coin tax for the next 2 years. They must prove dependable, delivering the raw materials in timely fashion. If they fail, the full coin tax will resume without negotiation. Brienne exhaled in relief. I believe they will find that acceptable, Your Grace. Thank you. This might avert bloodshed. He nodded curtly. Make sure they know it is a temporary measure. The realm remains one. If they interpret this as weakness, I will respond as I always do. She bowed, gratitude tinged with solemnity. I will make your message clear. Before leaving the capital, she asked quietly if she might see the Wolf Dragon's new city, the places being rebuilt from Daenerys's devastation. Jon granted permission, and she walked through the streets, marveling at how much had changed since she had last been here. Where once charred ruins lay, new stone structures stood in neat rows. The damage inflicted by dragonfire was nearly erased, replaced by an orderly design that left the city more navigable, if somewhat less whimsical. Everywhere, crown soldiers patrolled, vigilant. Merchant stalls bustled, selling goods from across the sea. But the hush of fear was there too. No one wanted to cross the king or his men. Brienne departed soon after, bearing the new compromise northward. Jon watched her go from the Red Keep's ramparts, Ghost by his side, the dire wolf gazing at the departing column of riders. He hoped that Sansa would recover enough to keep the North stable. He might have offered them a lifeline, but the realm needed every region to pull its weight. If they persisted in demanding special treatment, eventually he would have to meet them with force. He had no illusions about who would triumph in such a conflict. More weeks rolled on, and news came that the North cautiously accepted the compromise. Though some radical voices cried for outright independence, Sansa and the more moderate lords held them in check. The shipments of iron and timber began to trickle down, albeit slowly, as the roads and weather posed challenges. Jon's council eyed the arrangement warily, but the tension subsided, at least for the moment. Even Davos permitted himself a small sigh of relief, thinking that perhaps the realm had avoided another rebellion. Yet the hush did not abate. In taverns, men spoke quietly of the king's unwavering might. They repeated that no major wars had troubled Westeros since the Great War ended, that countless roads and harbors were better than ever. But they also recounted the relentless severity. Dark jokes sprang up about the heads rotting on the gates, about how traitors left the city one piece short. Some said it was the price for a lasting peace. Others said it was just another form of tyranny, that the wolf dragon was no better than the dragons of old, keeping order through fear. Jon's personal life remained as barren as ever. He had no queen, no children. The occasional rumor of a paramour or mistress flitted through courtly circles. But if there were any truth to them, it remained deeply hidden. By now, after nearly a decade of rule, he was well into his 30s, marked by scars both visible and unseen. The lines at the corners of his eyes betrayed the weight of every decision. No longer the reluctant hero, he had become the unyielding pillar that propped the realm. If at times that pillar felt hollow, he told no one. In his solar, he sometimes thought of the old days. Sam at the wall, Tormund and the free folk beyond the remains of that colossal ice structure. Arya wandering in unknown lands, Bran drifting in a realm of ravens and magic. He recalled the feel of Ygritte's hand, Daenerys' fervent gaze, Sansa's worried eyes. All of them shaped him or left scars on him, until he had no room left for softness. And so he pressed on with the only identity left. The king who saved Westeros from darkness, the king who would never allow another apocalypse, not if it meant crushing every seed of discord. In his nightmares, he sometimes glimpsed the White Walkers again, or the charred skeletons of kings landing under dragonfire. He would wake in a sweat, the memory fueling his resolve. One dawn, the master of whispers, Rissala, came with news that threatened to unravel the uneasy quiet. The faith might be stirring again. She spoke in hushed tones in the king's private audience chamber, watched only by a pair of guards at the doors. Jon listened, face impassive, as she relayed rumors of a hidden sect that believed the crown had turned away from the Seven, that the faith had become a mere puppet to royal demands. Word had it that certain septons quietly preached that a king who never prayed was unfit. They did not openly call for rebellion, but some of their words were borderline treasonous, encouraging the faithful to resist unholy edicts. Rissala had discovered gatherings in back rooms of half-rebuilt septs in the Crownlands and the Reach. Jon considered the matter carefully. He knew the faith could be a powerful force. History reminded him of the faith militant rising against Targaryens in the past. He had no desire to repeat that. "Does the High Septon know of this sect?" he asked. Rissala folded her hands. "If he does, he pretends ignorance. Or he's not in full control of his own subordinate septons. The movement is small but growing. They see your heavy taxation, your seeming lack of piety, your foreign alliances as signs that you are more tyrant than protector." Jon gave a mirthless laugh. "They prefer the realm to be weak at war with itself? The gods help them if that's the case. What do you recommend?" "Nd?" Rissala weighed her words. "Squashing them openly might inflame popular sympathy. But if you allow them to spread, who knows how many hearts they'll turn. The small folk often cling to religion in hard times. The Great September is still in ruins, though partially restored. Perhaps a demonstration of your respect for the Seven could help undercut their message. Or we could quietly remove their leaders, make them vanish so the movement never takes root." Jon's eyes flickered. He recalled how Daenerys' father, the Mad King, had burned dissenters, how the Great September had been destroyed more than once in these last decades. Another open confrontation with the faith was the last thing he wanted. Yet letting them sow seeds of doubt also seemed dangerous. "Start by identifying their leaders," he said at length. "But do not act yet. I want to see if there's a path to quell their grievances without another purge. If they become truly rebellious, we'll stamp them out." Rissala inclined her head. "Yes, Your Grace. I'll keep you informed." In the following weeks, the king made small but deliberate gestures toward the faith. He directed a bit more funding to the reconstruction of the Great September's outer wings, ensuring it could serve the faithful who still flocked there. He invited the High Septon to court, listened, at least outwardly, to his blessings. The High Septon was a soft-spoken man named Petres, chosen largely for his lack of grand ambitions. He appeared grateful for the new coin, praising the king's generosity. Meanwhile, Jon never once knelt in public prayer. He found no solace in the Seven. But politically, it made sense to show some measure of cooperation. Despite these efforts, rumors trickled through the city that certain septons still preached clandestinely. Some said the king had sacrificed the realm's spirit for harsh order. Others invoked stories of past Targaryen tyranny. Occasionally, a wild rumor claimed the king was a secret worshipper of the old gods or even ruler. Jon ignored the gossip. His mind was on the practicalities of rule. But he could not deny that tension was creeping upward again, like water seeping through cracks in a dam. Then, an unexpected letter arrived from Braavos. An invitation to attend a grand celebration at the Sea Lord's Palace, a festival in honor of a new alliance among the free cities. The letter praised the king's efforts to restore Westeros and suggested that his presence would cement a friendly relationship with Braavos. Normally, a king of Westeros did not travel to foreign courts unless compelled by dire circumstances. Yet the possibility intrigued Jon. A show of amity might help secure Braavosi goodwill, possibly deter other free cities from interfering with Westeros. He consulted the small council. Some voiced concerns about leaving King's Landing. The realm's precarious hush could fracture if the king sailed away for weeks. Others pointed out that Braavos might see it as a slight if he refused. In the end, Jon decided to send an envoy instead of going personally, citing pressing matters at home. He wrote a careful reply, thanking the Sea Lord but expressing regret that the security of the realm demanded his presence. He promised to dispatch Davos Seaworth as his chief representative, a sign of high esteem. When the Braavosi read Jon's polite refusal, they might suspect the real reason was that the wolf dragon dared not leave his kingdom unwatched for too long. Still, they could hardly take offense to receiving such an esteemed envoy. Davos prepared to depart, albeit reluctantly. He worried about leaving Jon without his counsel. But Jon insisted. Perhaps he also needed a break from Davos's gentle moral caution. The day Davos set sail, the harbor thronged with Braavosi vessels, sails bright with sigils of the Titan. The master of ships boarded a sleek galley, flanked by a small retinue of Westerosi knights and functionaries. Jon stood on the docks, cloak stirring in the sea breeze, to bid him farewell. Davos clasped his arm. "Mind yourself while I'm gone," Davos said quietly. "These new developments with the Faith and the North, be careful." Jon gave a faint nod. "I can handle it. Return quickly." The sails unfurled, and Davos's ship glided out into Blackwater Bay. Jon watched until the vessel was a mere speck on the horizon, then turned away, stifling a sense of unease. With Davos gone, the small council was composed mostly of those who had learned to keep their heads down and their loyalty loud. Rissala, the master of whispers, might be cunning, but she lacked Davos's moral compass. The master of coin was more concerned with treasury matters than public sentiment. The master of laws was a stern man who believed wholeheartedly in the king's ruthless approach. If a crisis flared now, Jon had few voices urging restraint. Within days, a flicker of that crisis appeared. A peasant revolt in the Reach. A minor one, but enough to alarm local lords. 70 or 80 farmers had refused to surrender their harvest to crown tax collectors, forming a blockade around a granary near Highgarden. The local garrison demanded surrender. The farmers resisted. Blood was spilled. The lords appealed to King's Landing for guidance. Jon's response was swift. He sent a sternly worded order. The farmers must comply or face lethal force. The blockade was broken by the local garrison. Some peasants were killed, others arrested. The ringleaders ended up swinging from the gallows. The Reach lords breathed a sigh of relief, praising the king's decisive rule. But far away on the rumor winds, talk of the incident spread. The wolf dragon does not spare the small folk. Resist and die. Almost at the same time, a spate of piracy erupted in the narrow sea. The Stepstones had always been a haven for pirate crews, but they seemed newly emboldened. Some wondered if an old sell-sail company, perhaps aided by a foreign city envious of Braavos and Westeros's budding alliance, was behind it. Jon ordered the royal fleet to patrol aggressively, capturing or sinking the pirates. More ships meant more taxes to pay for their upkeep, more sailors, more coin. The realm's burdens swelled as security demands grew. Then came the storm of news he had half feared. Uprisings in the north. At first, only scattered incidents. a crown tax collector found murdered on a lonely road near the Wolfswood, a storehouse of iron shipments burned by unknown arsonists. Sansa wrote, her words pained, "I am doing all I can to keep the peace, but these acts grow bolder. I suspect a group calling themselves the True North is behind it. They claim the North should answer only to a Stark. Some call you a Targaryen pretender." Jon felt anger burn beneath his ribs as he read her letter alone in the Red Keep Solar. So the old dream of northern independence still lived. This so-called True North spat on the realm's unity. They sabotaged shipments and killed crown officials. If left unchecked, it would spread like rot. He summoned the Master of Laws and demanded an answer. They decided to dispatch a force of crown soldiers, supported by loyal northern houses, those who had not turned. Let them crush the True North rebellion swiftly. Jon wrote a letter to Sansa, informing her that loyalist troops would soon arrive to restore order. He asked her to support them with her local knights. He tried to keep a civil tone, but frustration seared every line. "We have sacrificed enough for petty divisions. The realm stands, and the North stands with it." And so a new campaign began. The Crown's men marched up the King's Road, banners of the wolf dragon flying. They intended to root out the rebels wherever they lurked. Lords known to be friendly with House Stark but also loyal to the king accompanied them. Others, less enthusiastic, hung back. Sansa herself was still convalescent, not well enough to ride at the head of an army. In her place, she sent what loyal men she could muster. The synergy was uneasy. On the Crown side, the commanders had orders: no mercy for rebels. Among the northern lords, some bristled at the intrusion of southerners on their land. The first skirmishes were small. A handful of rebels ambushed a crown patrol near the Bar Rollins, inflicting a few casualties before vanishing into the woods. Another group tried to raid a supply wagon at a crossroads. The crown soldiers responded with ruthless efficiency, burning any village rumored to harbor them. Soon, flames licked at old wooden huts, and peasants fled or died. Horrified whispers drifted south. The king's men were repeating the old Targaryen playbook of punishing entire communities for the acts of a few. Yet, from the viewpoint of the crown generals, the northern smallfolk had aided and abetted outlaws, refusing to turn them in. That was treason. Letter after letter arrived at the Red Keep, each more dire. The True North rebels proved elusive, using forests and hidden paths to strike fast and disappear. The crown forces demanded northern guides, but many guides led them astray, possibly out of fear or hidden sympathy. The campaign dragged on, with frustration mounting. The crown's commander, Ser Lambert Hill, wrote to Jon, "We need more men, more supplies. Also, the cooperation of House Serwin, House Manderly, and others is half-hearted. I suspect they do not want to spill northern blood for a cause they find questionable. Lady Sansa does what she can, but she is not well enough to rally them personally. Morale is low. We have made some arrests, yet we cannot locate the ringleaders. We suspect they hide somewhere deep in the Wolfswood or even beyond the Gift. Kindly advise." Jon read these dispatches in grim silence. Part of him wanted to ride north himself, remind them all who they served. But leaving King's Landing in this climate was dangerous. The faith's unrest, the potential for other lords to see an opening, no, he could not. So he wrote back to Ser Lambert, instructing him to increase pressure on the local populations. Force them to give up the rebels. If entire villages needed to be relocated or locked away in forts, so be it. The realm could not afford another war. He ended his letter with, "Crush them swiftly," so the campaign escalated. The crown forces enacted harsh measures. Anyone caught giving food or shelter to suspected rebels faced imprisonment or execution. The rebels responded by attacking supply lines more boldly, stirring local sympathy with each new atrocity from the south. Sansa's letters grew increasingly desperate, urging Jon to temper the crown's brutality. She reminded him that the North was proud, that heavy-handed tactics would only inflame them. He refused to bend. Instead, he commanded that the ring of discipline tighten. If the North believed it could cling to old illusions of independence, they would learn otherwise. A gloom settled over King's Landing. In the markets, People spoke of the northern revolt in hushed tones, wondering if it might spread. Some recalled the days when House Stark declared the North free under Robb Stark, decades ago. They remembered that war ended badly for the Starks, but also cost the Lannisters dearly. Now, a Targaryen Stark king forced the North to remain loyal with an iron fist. Was that truly peace, or just a prelude to a bigger conflict? Jon seldom left the Red Keep, immersed in strategies. Rysala's network tried to identify the true North's leaders, rumored to be minor lords or seasoned warriors from the Great War. She learned that some veterans who fought alongside Jon against the White Walkers felt betrayed by his treatment of the North, especially after all their sacrifices. They formed the backbone of the rebellion, seeing him as a Targaryen occupant rather than a Stark champion. Rysala recommended infiltration assassination attempts on the leaders. Jon approved, though his heart felt heavier with each order. These might be men who once stood at his side on the fields of winter. Still, the realm must stand. The realm must be unbroken. Then one fateful day, news arrived that House Serwin had apparently allowed true North rebels to hide in their woods. A crown patrol found evidence that the Serwins had not tried to root them out. A scuffle ensued, leaving 2 crown soldiers dead. Enraged, Ser Lambert demanded Lord Serwin's fealty. The proud lord refused, claiming he could not control bandits in his domain. Tensions escalated, culminating in crown forces storming Serwin's keep. In the chaos, an arrow struck Lord Serwin dead. His men fought back but were outnumbered. The keep was seized in the name of the crown. Serwin's household was cast out or imprisoned. The lord's wife and children were rumored to have fled deeper into the north, possibly to Winterfell for refuge. When word of this reached Jon, a hush wrapped the Red Keep like a funeral shroud. House Serwin was old and loyal to House Stark for generations. Now it was effectively wiped out, all for harboring or failing to stop a group of rebels. Some said the blame lay with Ser Lambert, an overzealous commander. Others said the blame lay at Jon's feet, for he had given them free rein to crush the uprising. Sansa's next letter arrived in tears, describing the heartbreak of the Serwin tragedy and begging Jon to end the madness. She wrote, "The North can still be part of your realm if you let us breathe. This carnage will fuel hatred for generations. I beg you to remember your father's values, to remember the people you loved here. Do not force me to stand by and watch more of my own people burn." Jon crumpled her letter in his fist, pacing the solar. She still did not understand. Letting the North breathe might well encourage them to keep defying the crown. Yet he could not deny that events were spiraling out of control. Each crackdown fueled more resistance. Each death seeded new hatred. It was a smaller-scale war, but a war nonetheless. He gathered the small council, minus Davos, still in Bravos, and demanded solutions. The Master of Laws championed an even bigger show of force. More men, more destruction. Break the North once and for all. The Master of Coin worried about the cost. Rysala suggested carefully orchestrated negotiations, offering amnesty if the rebels laid down arms, while simultaneously targeting the leaders. Jon weighed it all. In the end, he chose to offer a short window of amnesty. A royal decree was sent north. Any rebel who surrendered in the next fortnight would be spared death, instead sentenced to serve at the wall, what was left of it, or in forced labor camps. Those who refused would be hunted without mercy. He hoped that fear of total annihilation might break the rebels' resolve. Ser Lambert posted this decree in towns, reading it aloud at local seps. A few rebels gave themselves up, mostly those weary of running. But the core group remained defiant, ridiculing the king's mercy as a sham. Skirmishes continued. Meanwhile, Sansa tried to mediate. She sent envoys to the rebels, urging them to surrender. The true North responded by calling her a puppet of a Targaryen tyrant, ignoring her pleas. The North was fracturing beneath her feet. Her health faltered again, according to the Maester's reports. Jon came to an agonizing crossroads. Either he escalated further, sending more soldiers to crush the movement once and for all, or he eased the crown's presence and risked the rebels taking advantage. He saw no middle path, not after all that had happened. So, with his heart feeling like stone, he ordered the muster of additional troops. 1,000 men from the Crownlands and the Westerlands marched north, joined by a regiment of archers from the Vale. This time there would be no half measures. They would sweep the Wolfswood, the mountains, wherever the rebels lurked, and end it. He wrote to Sansa, telling her to clear the roads, to let his army do its work. But the night before they departed, a surprising messenger arrived in King's Landing. Lady Brienne of Tarth again, weary from another long journey. She asked for an immediate audience with the king. Jon, though irritated and exhausted, granted it. She stood before him in the solar, armor dusty, hair unkempt, her face etched with sorrow. "Your Grace, I came from Winterfell. Lady Sansa is near death. The stress of this conflict has broken her health. Her last request is to see you, to beg you to find a better way before the North tears itself apart." Jon felt something twist inside. Sansa, near death. When did you leave her side? 8 days ago. The maester said she might not last a fortnight. She grows weaker every day. She can barely speak but kept asking for you. He closed his eyes, warring with himself. If he left King's Landing now, as the campaign was about to ramp up, it might sow confusion or appear like uncertainty. But how could he refuse Sansa, possibly for the last time? He remembered the words she had written, the desperate pleas. He saw in his mind's eye the quiet redhead who had once survived unimaginable trials. She was his last real family. The realm or Sansa, or both. He remembered how, once, he had gone to her side when she was ill, and the realm survived. Perhaps his generals could handle the campaign. He could lay out directives and trust them to carry it through. One final farewell to Sansa might be worth any risk. He spoke in a low voice. "I will go. Gather an escort, Lady Brienne. We leave at dawn." She looked relieved, though also apprehensive. "Thank you, Your Grace. For her sake, thank you." And so, once again, Jon Snow, Jon Targaryen, prepared to ride north. This time, the city watched in a hush of mounting worry. The king was leaving in the midst of a rebellion to visit a dying lady who symbolized the North's heart. What might happen in his absence? Some at court whispered that if the king softened at Sansa's bedside, it might open the door for the rebels. Others whispered that if he remained too hard, it might break him once and for all. Jon put Ser Lambert in charge of the new campaign, giving him the authority to proceed with the final sweep. He cautioned him to remain mindful of the realm's image, but to do whatever was necessary to stamp out the rebels. Then, with a carefully chosen retinue of knights and Brienne's escort, he departed King's Landing. Ghost trotted close by. The journey felt like stepping into a storm cloud. Over the years, every time he returned to the north, trouble hovered like a vulture. They rode fast. Jon barely rested, driving them onward. Days blurred. The southern fields gave way to the rocky hills and swamps of the Neck, then the cold roads beyond Moat Cailin. Snow flurries danced in the air at times, reminding him that the seasons in the north were harsh even now. At last, they climbed the final stretch to Winterfell. He arrived at dusk, the old gray walls looming like a memory of ghosts. Guards bowed, weariness written on their faces. Smoke drifted from the chimneys, and the courtyard lay silent under a dusting of snow. Inside, he found the maester waiting, anxiety etched into his features. "She is still with us, but drifting in and out," he said. "Hurry." Jon made his way to Sansa's chamber. The corridors were dimly lit by torches. At the door, he paused, recalling how he had done this before. Inside, he found Sansa propped on pillows, eyes closed, her skin like parchment. Her hair, once so vibrant, had dulled with illness. Her breathing was shallow. The maids and Asepta stood by, glancing at Jon with worry. He approached, removing his gloves. Gently, he placed a hand on hers. She stirred at the touch, her eyelids fluttering open. Took her a moment to focus. Then, recognition dawned, and a fragile smile curved her lips. "Jon, you came," she whispered. He nodded, swallowing hard. "I'm here. Don't try to speak too much." She shook her head faintly. "I must. I have so little time." He sank onto the stool by her bedside, gesturing for the others to give them space. They withdrew to the far side of the room, out of earshot, while Brienne guarded the door. Sansa's breath rattled. "You once were the best of us, Jon. You gave us hope. Please, don't let what's left of our house be tarnished by more bloodshed. The true North. They are misguided, but your men burn villages. Children die in the crossfire. Don't you see? It will never truly end if you force them this way." He closed his eyes, pained. "They murdered crown soldiers, Sansa. They sabotaged the realm's laws. They want independence, which will only weaken us all." She coughed weakly, and it seemed to tear at her chest. "You could negotiate. Give the North more autonomy under the crown. Meet them halfway. Find a solution that doesn't require that we kill each other. You are their king, yes, but also a Stark. If you bring reason, not terror, they might listen." He shook his head. "I tried half measures. They spat on them. They only grow bolder. The realm must hold firm." She pressed her lips together, tears glinting in her eyes. "Your realm is built on fear. That fear will birth hatred. I beg you, for the sake of the love we once shared as a family, try another way." The raw plea in her voice tore at him. He remembered how badly he had wanted to keep the realm safe from any new nightmares. Perhaps, with Sansa dying, he could do this one thing for her. But an even stronger voice in his mind, forged by a decade of betrayals, insisted that compromise meant weakness and that the rebels would never stop until they broke free or he broke them. He gripped her hand. "I will see what can be done," he said at last, words strangled. "But I can't promise to let them carve the North away. I swore to keep the realm united." Sansa exhaled softly. "You might keep the land united, but you're losing the people. If I can persuade the moderate northern lords to speak with you, would you come to a meeting? Would you at least talk to them? Not just your soldiers." Jon felt conflict churn. Finally, he gave a slow nod. "Yes, for you. I will talk. But if they demand independence, I can't yield." She swallowed, relief warring with fatigue. "Thank you. We can find a middle path. The North as part of your realm, but with some self-governance, some measure of respect. It might defuse the rebellion." He brushed a lock of hair from her brow, as he might have done long ago. "Rest now." A faint smile tugged her lips. "You look so tired. We've both been fighting too long." He squeezed her hand, wishing he had something comforting to say. But all he could do was sit vigil as her breathing rattled in her throat. The maester came over, checking her pulse, offering some mild draught for pain. Sansa drifted into a fitful sleep. Jon remained at her side, even as the night deepened. He thought of the words he had told her, the partial promise of a negotiation. Could it truly avert further bloodshed? Or was it just another trap for him to walk into? He did not know, but the sight of Sansa, so frail and fading, made him want to try, if only for the memory of family, if only to keep from losing the last piece of his old self. Come morning, he emerged from her chamber, hollow-eyed, calling for the northern lords who remained at Winterfell to gather. Among them were men who once respected him deeply and men who now looked upon him with suspicion. He explained that Lady Sansa had asked him to open negotiations to end the rebellion. He would meet any northern lord or representative of the rebels under a flag of truce. If they came peaceably, he would do the same. But he made it clear, if they spurned this chance, the Crown's campaign would continue, unstoppable. Messages flew like ravens. Some lords expressed guarded optimism. Perhaps they could avoid further devastation. Others worried that the rebels would never trust the king. Still, envoys ventured into the Wolfswood, searching for the true North's leaders. Days passed with no word. Then, at last, a ragged rider appeared at Winterfell's gates, bearing a short letter written in a harsh scrawl. It accepted the meeting but demanded it take place deep in the Wolfswood, near an ancient weirwood grove, without a heavy escort. Jon weighed the risk. This smelled like a trap. Yet, if he refused, the rebels would claim he was insincere, and Sansa's plea would be for naught. After conferring with Brienne and a few trusted knights, he decided to go, but not alone. He would take a small honor guard. If the rebels meant to kill him, they would pay a steep price. That dusk, he visited Sansa's chamber again, telling her of the arrangement. Her eyes, clouded by fever, shone with fragile hope. "Be careful," she whispered. "They're desperate, but they might still speak reason. Show them you remember what it means to be a Stark." He tried to smile, but his heart felt heavy. "Rest. I will do my best." At first light, he set out with Brienne, a handful of loyal knights and Ghost. The ground was dusted with fresh snow that crunched under the horses' hooves. They traveled beneath towering pines, the hush of the forest profound. Now and then, they caught glimpses of movement among the trees. Perhaps deer, perhaps watchers. Tension coiled in every muscle. Jon wore his black armor, the direwolf Fandragon sigil on his cloak, Longclaw sheathed at his hip. They reached the designated clearing by mid-morning. It was a place where old weirwoods stood, their carved faces weeping red sap. The rebels had already arrived, grouped in the shadows. Perhaps 24 men in rough leathers, some masked. One stepped forward, a tall figure with iron-gray hair, face weathered by northern wind. Jon recognized him as Harold Reed, a veteran who once fought at the Battle of Winterfell. Another man at his side, younger, had a fresh scar across his cheek and cold fury in his eyes. A few wore battered pieces of old Stark livery, as though to claim the mantle of House Stark's independence. Jon halted. Brienne and the knights spread out behind him, hands near their swords but not yet drawn. Ghost stood at Jon's flank, silent as death. Harold Reed eyed the king with a mix of wariness and bitterness. "You come, then, truly?" Jon inclined his head. "Sansa Stark asked me to speak with you, so speak. Do you want peace, or do you demand the impossible?" A murmur rippled among the rebels. The younger man with the scar spat on the ground. "Peace under your yoke? We watched your men burn out villages, kill our kin for refusing to kneel." Jon's jaw tightened. "You murdered crown soldiers, sabotaged shipments, forced my hand. If you want to keep fighting, we can. My armies are on the verge of sweeping the north." Harold exhaled slowly. "And more blood will soak the snow. Is that what you want? Sansa says you might offer a compromise." Jon took a breath, remembering Sansa's frail voice. "I will not grant independence," he said, letting that ring clearly. "But I'll consider an arrangement, a measure of autonomy for the north, some self-governance, local control over taxes. You would remain under the crown's authority, but with more leeway than other regions. In return, you lay down arms, cease all rebellion. You recognize me as your king. The alternative is continued war." Several rebels muttered curses. The younger man snarled, "We want a king in the north, not a Targaryen pretender who was never truly one of us." Jon's hand drifted toward Longclaw's hilt, but he forced himself to remain still. "I was raised a Stark. I died for the North once. That remains part of me, no matter my blood." The scarred man sneered. "You died for the North, yes, but now you kill Northerners without a second thought." Brienne bristled, stepping forward. "He gave you reason after reason to yield. You chose violence. Blood is on your hands too." A rumble of tension swept the rebels. Several clutched their weapons. Harold held up a hand. "Stop. Enough. Both of you." He turned back to Jon. "We have bled for you, we have died for you, and you repaid us with an iron fist. So why should we trust you now when you say you'll let us live if we kneel?" Jon's voice dropped low. "Because if you do not, you will be destroyed. Let us not pretend. My armies will see to it. But if you kneel, if you end this, I will honor the autonomy I offer. Sansa Stark will ensure I keep my word. She is your warden, and I trust her to hold me accountable." That name caused a stir among them. Sansa was widely respected, even among many rebels. Harold studied Jon for a long moment, as if trying to read the truth behind those dark eyes. Ghost growled softly, feeling the tension in the air. Finally, Harold said, "If we kneel, we want proof, not just words. We want a written charter granting the North full control over local taxes, the right to enforce our own laws so long as they don't conflict with the Crown's basic mandates. We want the Crown's troops removed from the north once peace is assured, leaving only a token royal presence. No more men scouring our forests, no more burning villages. Jon's mind spun. That was a significant concession, effectively letting the North govern itself under a Stark warden. It might keep the realm nominally united, but the North would be one step short of independence. If he refused, the war continued. Could he swallow that? Could he trust that once the troops were gone, they wouldn't stir up the same trouble again? He thought of Sansa, dying in Winterfell. He thought of the realm he had fought so long to keep from fracturing. But also, he considered that continuing this war might only sow more rebellions elsewhere. The realm was fatigued by war. The North would never truly be tamed by fear alone. Perhaps giving them this measure would secure loyalty of a different sort, at least for a generation. He spoke slowly, measuring each word. Very well. I will draft such a charter under the condition that the North recognizes the king's right to call banners if the realm is threatened, that the crown's laws remain the highest law, and that any new conflict with the crown invalidates the arrangement. Sansa Stark shall remain warden of the North, answerable to me. If you accept those terms, lay down your arms. If you refuse, my armies march. A ripple of shock passed through the rebels. The scarred man spat again, but others looked thoughtful. Some were tired, wounded, longing for an end. Harold Reed took a shaky breath. You would sign that? Put your seal to it. Jon nodded slowly. I will, provided you do the same, and guarantee that all northern rebels surrender their weapons. If there are pockets who refuse, you bring them to heel. No more excuses that you can't control them. Harold exchanged glances with the others. That is a risk, but if you truly uphold this, we may accept. Jon extended a hand. The war ends here, or it never ends at all. Harold hesitated, then clasped Jon's forearm. The two men stared into each other's eyes, both scarred by the dead of winter battles, by betrayals, by a sense that the North could not remain what it was under the wolf dragon's rule. And yet, here they stood, forging a fragile peace. Attention snapped, replaced by a wary sense of relief. Both sides eased back, though not without suspicious glances. Jon agreed to have the charter drafted at Winterfell, with lords from both sides present. The rebels would cease operations, sending word to their scattered bands. The king's new army would hold its position, not advancing unless the rebels broke the truce. Thus ended the meeting, surprisingly without bloodshed. Jon and his guard rode away, hearts pounding with the enormity of what had just transpired. Brienne glanced at him sideways. You've given the North almost everything they demanded. Jon flexed his gloved hand on the reins. Not everything. They remain part of the realm. They cannot set their own foreign policy or ignore the crown if I call the banners. But yes, more freedom than any region has had in a century. Brienne allowed a faint smile. Sansa will be proud. He gazed into the snowy forest ahead. She forced my hand, in a way, but perhaps it was time. Ruling them by fear alone was never going to last. They reached Winterfell by dusk. Jon immediately went to Sansa's chamber, brimming with subdued urgency to share the news, hoping it would ease her final days. The maester admitted him. She was awake but looked frilier than ever, her breath rattling in her chest. He knelt by the bed, taking her hand gently. I met with them, he whispered, his voice thick. We're negotiating a charter that grants them autonomy. They remain under the crown in name, but the day-to-day rule is theirs. The rebellion will end. A tremor of joy passed over her features, though it was tempered by weakness. She squeezed his hand. Thank you, Jon. He leaned closer, voice husky with emotion. It's for you, Sansa. You were right. We can't keep butchering each other. I only wish I had done it sooner. A tear slid down her cheek. I'm so glad. You'll be the king we hoped for. The realm might truly heal now. He wanted to say more, but her eyes fluttered shut. Her breath rattled, and the maester stepped forward, pressing an ear to her chest. After a tense moment, he shook his head, brow creased. "She's slipping. I'm sorry, Your Grace." Jon bowed his head, feeling tears prick at his eyes. He would not leave. He sat at her bedside, holding her hand through the night, listening to her ragged breathing. Memories assailed him. The courtyard of Winterfell when they were children, the heartbreak of losing so many. And now her final gift to the realm was coaxing him away from relentless tyranny. She was the last living Stark who shared his childhood. In the gray light of dawn, she stirred one final time, her lips forming his name. He leaned close, and she whispered, barely audible, "Jon, thank you. Be better." Then her breathing ceased. The maester confirmed it with trembling hands. Brienne bowed her head. The room fell into a deep hush, broken only by Jon's ragged exhale. He felt an avalanche of grief press on his chest. He lowered his forehead to hers, murmuring a farewell no one else could hear. Sansa was gone. He remembered how she once begged him not to become this cold, merciless creature. And in her last hours, she guided him toward a compromise that might save the North from further horror. She had been the best of them, in her own careful, steadfast way. The news of Lady Sansa Stark's death spread through Winterfell like a chill wind. The gates were draped in black, the direwolf banners lowered in mourning. Even the rebels, hearing of it, reportedly laid down weapons to honor her passing. She was buried in the crypts of Winterfell among her ancestors, a solemn ceremony attended by lords, knights, and small folk. Jon stood at the forefront, black cloak billowing, ghost at his side, as they lowered her into the tomb. The old kings of winter seemed to watch with stony faces. Afterward, he retreated into solitude for a day, refusing all visitors. Some feared he might revert to old ferocity, punishing the North for taking Sansa from him. But when he emerged, he addressed the assembled lords in Winterfell's great hall and announced that the drafting of the charter would proceed. In memory of Sansa Stark, who worked tirelessly for peace, he would honor the agreement. He would leave in place a smaller garrison, but the bulk of crown forces would stand down once the rebels were disarmed. The North would rule itself, with a warden appointed by the crown, but day-to-day matters and taxes would be set locally. In exchange, the North recognized the king's ultimate authority in times of war or crisis. It was a compromise that some called half a kingdom. Others called it a wise measure that might finally unite the realm in something better than fear. The true North rebels, seeing they had achieved most of what they wanted short of outright independence, agreed to lay down arms. Many wept for Sansa, who had brokered that peace with her final breath. House Serwin's holdings, ravaged by conflict, would be restored to a distant cousin who pledged loyalty. Manderley's and other major houses lined up, relieved that the killing would end. Jon oversaw the official signing of the charter in Winterfell's hall. Half a dozen northern lords affixed their seals, representing the rebellious faction and the loyal faction. Jon added his own, the direwolf Fandragon stamp pressed into hot wax. The watchers bowed in unison as the great hall filled with a heavy silence. Outside, the snow fell gently, as though the old gods themselves wept for Sansa. In the days that followed, crown soldiers began withdrawing from the north, carrying the bodies of fallen comrades for proper burials. The rebels returned from the woods, battered and exhausted, some bitter, some grateful. The maesters recorded the settlement as a historic moment, something akin to the old arrangement the Targaryens once granted Dorne. Only this time it was the North receiving near independence under the Wolf Dragon's reign. Jon lingered in Winterfell a little longer, ensuring the handover went smoothly. He named a trusted Stark cousin, an older woman with a calm, diplomatic nature, to act as warden in Sansa's stead for now. The northern lords accepted her, seeing a hint of Stark blood as a sign that the North was still governed by its own. Ghost seemed at ease in the cold, trotting across the courtyard that had once been home. Jon felt the old walls pressing upon him with memories, but he could not stay. The rest of Westeros awaited him, a realm that needed his presence in King's Landing. When he finally departed, the northern wind keened. Many small folk and soldiers lined the yard, watching in hushed respect. A few knelt, some saluted, some glared, but no one attacked. The North had changed, and so had he. The hush that followed him now was not purely fear, but also the grief for Sansa, the last link to a past that might have been kinder. He rode south with his retinue, Ghost at his side, his heart burdened. He had compromised, yielded part of the realm's direct control for the sake of peace. Did that make him weaker or wiser? He thought of the day he refused to bend to the North's pleas, the countless lives lost in the conflict. Would it have been easier to do this from the start? Perhaps, but that was not the path he had walked. Sansa had paid the price, as had so many others. As he traveled, the snows gave way to muddy roads, then greener fields. Letters reached him from King's Landing, reporting on the Faith's continuing murmurs, the Braavosi trade quarter, minor unrest in the Stormlands over rumored pirate attacks. The realm was never truly calm, but at least one front of war had closed. He carried with him a tangle of emotions: relief that the North would no longer bleed, sorrow at losing Sansa, uncertainty about how the Lords of Westeros would view this new arrangement. Yet quietly he felt a new sense of possibility. The wolf dragon had shown a measure of restraint and negotiation. It did not erase all the blood on his hands, but it might spark a different future. Upon returning to the capital, he was greeted with cautious respect. The courtyard of the Red Keep filled with courtiers bowing in unison. Some seemed tense, as if unsure whether the king would be furious or triumphant. He dismounted, ignoring the flurry of anxious chatter. Inside the throne room, the Master of Coin, the Master of Whispers, and others awaited him with extensive reports. He waved away the formalities, turning first to Rissala. "Any news from the North in recent days?" he asked. She blinked, then dipped her head. "We hear the rebels stand down as you intended. The people are celebrating the memory of Lady Sansa." Jon nodded, a heaviness in his voice. "Good." The Master of Laws approached, face pinched with confusion. "Your Grace, forgive my bluntness, but some lords in the South fear you've set a precedent. They question why the North should gain such freedoms while they remain fully bound to the crown. Are you prepared to deal with demands from Dorne, the Reach, or others for a similar arrangement?" Jon's gaze flicked to him, a test. He could respond with the old iron stance, or show the new pragmatism Sansa had taught him. "The North has unique history, unique conditions," he said at last, "and their taxes, as well as the vow to answer my call in time of war, remain. This was not a gift. It was the settlement of a civil conflict. If the Southern Lords wish to rebel, they may see how that ends." That final note of steel in his voice reassured the council that the wolf dragon's fangs were still sharp. No immediate wave of demands was likely to follow. Most lords valued peace over a fruitless war. With that, the matter was closed, officially at least. Later that night, Jon walked alone on the battlements, gazing over King's Landing. The city glowed with torches and lanterns, the hum of countless voices drifting upward. Ghost padded beside him, ears twitching at the sounds. The night breeze was cooler than usual, reminding him faintly of the North's chill. He thought of how far he had come. The boy who once knew nothing, the Lord Commander who tried to save the world from the dead, the man who ascended the Iron Throne after so much tragedy. He had become a ruthless king, forging peace through fear. But in the end, it was a spark of compassion, Sansa's final plea, that brought a measure of genuine resolution to the North's rebellion. Her memory echoed in his mind. Be better. Was he truly better? Or just older, more tired, forced into a compromise by circumstances? Perhaps both. Perhaps it did not matter. The realm had survived one more trial. For now. He looked down at Ghost, placed a hand on the direwolf's back, and felt the warmth of living fur. In the distance, the new harbor bristled with Braavosi ships. Some men who roamed the city's taverns likely sang half-hearted songs about the wolf dragon's uncertain mercy. He stood there for a long time, letting the wind tug at his cloak. The hush of the city was not so silent as before. There was commerce, rebuilding, new chances. Fear remained, but maybe, just maybe, there was room for something else. He turned away from the battlements at last, returning to the Red Keep, to the responsibilities that awaited. Tomorrow, more decisions, more crises, more petitions would flood his throne. He would face them with the same stern resolve, yet with a faint ember of hope that there could be a path that was neither blind ruthlessness nor foolish mercy, but a bridged middle ground that might keep the realm from tearing itself apart again. Long into the night, he thought of Sansa in the crypts of Winterfell, of all the ghosts that had shaped him. He did not weep, for tears felt foreign to him now, but his grief ran deep. Perhaps he would build a monument to her somewhere in King's Landing, or in the north, dedicated to the last Stark lady who tempered the wolf dragon's flame. The realm owed her that much, and so did he. No doubt he would face new storms ahead, a resentful faith, foreign intrigues, cunning lords, but the hush that lingered over Westeros felt a little less stifling and a bit more alive. In time, songs would speak of how King Jon Targaryen once nearly crushed the North, only to relent and forge a compromise that saved countless lives. Some would call him wise, others would call him weak. Some would call him the Wolf Dragon, forging a realm with a single unwavering will. Others would whisper that Sansa Stark was the true savior, the subtle heart that made the final difference. And in the end, the truth was a tangle of all those views, woven through the hush that followed a decade of nightmares. And so he reigned on, a man who had once died for the realm and now lived for it, neither hero nor monster, but some mixture shaped by heartbreak and necessity. The hush remained, but it carried at least the promise that fear was not the only path forward. In that hush, if one listened carefully, one could hear the faint notes of a better future, one born of compromise and memory, of sorrow and hope, bound forever by duty, but lit, however dimly, by the last flickering spark of the boy who was raised a Stark.